The land of Canaan stretches across a region that has long stood at the crossroads of civilizations, resting between the waters of the Mediterranean Sea and the desert expanses of Arabia, bordered by the fertile valleys of the Jordan River and the rugged hills that rise toward Lebanon and Syria. To understand the history of the Canaanites, one must first become familiar with the geography that shaped their existence. The terrain was neither uniform nor simple. It offered coastlines dotted with natural harbours, inland valleys that could sustain agriculture, mountain ranges that provided both protection and isolation, and arid lands where survival required ingenuity. This complex environment played a central role in forming the patterns of life that became distinctively Canaanite, for the geography provided not only resources but also challenges that demanded adaptation. The people who came to be known as the Canaanites did not emerge in a vacuum. They were the result of millennia of gradual settlement, interaction, and cultural fusion, each layer of habitation leaving its mark upon the land. Archaeological surveys across the region reveal human presence in the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods. The earliest communities were not yet urban or stratified, but rather clusters of farming families who learned to coax grain from the soil and domesticate animals along the fertile valleys and coastal plains. At sites like Jericho, often regarded as one of the oldest continually inhabited cities in the world, excavations have uncovered walls, towers, and evidence of organised communal life dating back more than 9,000 years. These early inhabitants established the groundwork for later developments, experimenting with irrigation, storing surplus crops, and constructing permanent dwellings that suggested both security and an awareness of communal identity. The land itself, with its seasonal rainfall and fertile soil, encouraged such experiments, and gradually these small villages became more stable, growing into the kind of settlements that could support larger populations and more complex social systems. As centuries passed, the communities of Canaan absorbed influences from neighbouring regions. To the south lay Egypt with its Nile-based agriculture and monumental architecture. To the east were the cultures of Mesopotamia, experimenting with kingship, writing, and religious complexity. Canaan sat between these worlds and inevitably felt their presence. Yet the people of Canaan also developed distinct features that cannot simply be reduced to external influences. Their location along trade routes that connected Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean meant that goods, ideas, and peoples flowed constantly through the land. Traders moved timber, metals, and luxury items through Canaanite ports. Caravans crossed deserts and valleys, leaving behind more than just goods, as they also transmitted languages, customs, and beliefs. What would later be recognised as the Canaanite identity emerged from this constant interplay of local traditions and foreign connections. The coastal plains offered fertile ground for agriculture, but the true importance of the coast lay in its harbours. Cities such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, though later better known as Phoenician, had their origins in the Canaanite world. These settlements thrived because the Mediterranean waters provided access to distant markets, and the cedar forest of Lebanon supplied highly prized timber for shipbuilding. Inland, the valleys of the Jordan and the Jezreel became agricultural hubs where wheat, barley, grapes, and olives flourished. The mountains provided minerals and stone for construction, while simultaneously forming barriers that divided communities into smaller, semi-independent polities. This fractured geography made political unification difficult, but it also encouraged diversity. Instead of a single centralized kingdom, the land supported multiple city-states, each with its own ruling elites, religious centers, and trade networks, yet all sharing cultural and linguistic ties that identified them collectively as Canaanite. The earliest inhabitants left behind more than ruins. They left cultural legacies in their tools, pottery, and burial practices. Archaeological layers from the Chalcolithic period, around the 4th millennium BCE, reveal significant advances in metallurgy and craft specialization. Copper tools, decorated ceramics, and evidence of trade in exotic items such as obsidian and shells suggest that even before the emergence of cities, Canaan was already integrated into a wide network of exchange. Burial practices from this period show communal tombs, often with grave goods, indicating beliefs about an afterlife and the importance of kinship groups. Such practices suggest that identity was tied not only to the living community, but also to ancestors who remained spiritually present. The land itself, dotted with caves and natural features, reinforced these traditions, as many early burial sites were located in prominent geographical locations that tied memory to the physical landscape. By the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE, the Canaanite world began to crystallize more clearly. Fortified towns appeared, with walls that spoke of both wealth and the need for defense. The construction of such fortifications suggests growing concerns about conflict, whether from rival towns or nomadic groups on the fringes of settled areas. The rise of fortified towns also points to increased social stratification, as leaders could command labour and resources sufficient to build and maintain large structures. These towns were often organised around central religious or administrative buildings, indicating the intertwining of spiritual and political authority. Temples discovered in sites such as Megiddo and Hazor reveal both the architectural sophistication of the Canaanites and the centrality of religious practice in daily life. These early city-states were not vast empires, but rather small centres of power, competing and cooperating in a delicate balance shaped by geography. The identity of the Canaanites was tied closely to their linguistic and cultural expressions. They spoke a Semitic language that shared roots with those of neighbouring peoples, but developed distinct forms over time. This language would eventually give rise to the Phoenician and Hebrew dialects, but in its early stages it was simply the spoken tongue of a people spread across diverse environments. Their religion reflected the same blend of local tradition and external influence. Deities tied to natural forces such as storms, fertility, and the sea reflected the realities of living in a land both generous and unpredictable. The worship of these deities often took place in high places or open-air sanctuaries, locations that physically linked communities to the landscape around them. The geographical diversity of Canaan shaped the interactions between its inhabitants and their neighbours. To the north, the influence of the Amorites and the city of Ugarit brought literary and mythological traditions that would deeply affect Canaanite culture. To the south, Egypt's growing power in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE increasingly drew Canaan into its orbit. Egyptian campaigns into Canaan are recorded in inscriptions and reliefs, and archaeological evidence shows Egyptian goods flowing into Canaanite towns. These connections were not one-sided domination, but rather complex relationships of tribute, trade, and sometimes rebellion. Canaanite rulers balanced loyalty to Egyptian overlords with local autonomy, navigating the shifting politics of a region perpetually contested. Yet beneath the political manoeuvring, everyday life in Canaan continued to be rooted in the land. Families cultivated fields, tended orchards, raised livestock, and engaged in local trade. Farmers used ploughs pulled by oxen, harvested crops in seasonal rhythms, and stored surpluses in communal granaries. Villagers lived in mud brick houses arranged around courtyards, where daily life centred on family and kinship ties. Pottery, often decorated with simple geometric designs, served both functional and symbolic purposes. Weaving, metalworking, and other crafts provided tools and goods for both domestic use and trade. These daily activities anchored the Canaanites in their environment, ensuring survival while connecting them to broader cultural patterns across the Near East. As the centuries moved forward, the early inhabitants of Canaan developed more sophisticated forms of governance. The city-state system fostered competition, but it also encouraged diplomacy. Inscriptions and tablets from the 2nd millennium BCE reveal correspondences between Canaanite rulers and foreign powers, particularly Egypt. These records show that even small towns had rulers who engaged in letter writing and gift exchange with pharaohs, evidence of both subordination and prestige. The famous Amarna letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform, demonstrate the complexity of Canaanite diplomacy, during the 14th century BCE, revealing local rulers requesting aid against rivals or offering tribute to secure favour. These letters provide a window into the political landscape of Canaan, where geography, local ambition, and foreign power intersected in intricate ways. The land's position as a corridor for armies and traders meant that it was rarely free from external pressures. Armies from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Egypt marched through its valleys. Caravans of merchants passed along its trade routes. Such constant movement fostered a society accustomed to adaptation. The Canaanites borrowed technologies, religious symbols, and cultural practices while maintaining their own traditions. This openness was not passive but active, for the Canaanites themselves contributed innovations, most notably the alphabetic script that would later transform communication across the Mediterranean. The invention of writing in a simplified alphabet, emerging from Canaanite scribal traditions, reflected both the practical needs of merchants and the intellectual creativity of a people living at the heart of cultural exchange. The earlier stages of Canaanite history, shaped by geography and early settlement, prepared the foundation for everything that followed. The rugged hills, fertile valleys, and coastal harbours formed a stage on which the drama of Canaanite civilization would unfold. The people who tilled the soil, built towns and worshipped their gods in temples and open-air sanctuaries, created a society that was resilient, adaptable, and deeply rooted in the land. Their interactions with powerful neighbours would bring both challenges and opportunities, but always the distinct identity of Canaan remained tied to its geography and the early communities who first shaped it. From these beginnings, the story of the Canaanites unfolds further into the rise of complex city-states, the emergence of a rich pantheon of deities, and the cultural achievements that would echo through the ancient world. The beginnings of Canaanite civilization can only be understood by looking deep into the long arc of human settlement that preceded the rise of their city-states. Long before names like Sidon, Byblos, or Hazor emerged, the valleys, hills, and plains of the Levant were already alive with human activity stretching back thousands of years. The Neolithic period, spanning from roughly 10,000 to 4500 BCE in this region, marked a transformation of human existence that would gradually lay the foundation for the societies that followed. In these centuries, scattered groups of hunter-gatherers began to experiment with domestication, with planting crops and keeping animals, and in doing so they shifted from temporary encampments to permanent settlements. This change from mobile bands to rooted communities was one of the most significant transitions in human history, and in Canaan it left a profound legacy. Jericho, located in the Jordan Valley, has often been cited as one of the earliest and most important sites of this transition. Archaeological excavations at Tel Sultan, the mound of ancient Jericho, have revealed multiple layers of settlement dating back to at least 9,000 BCE. Here, some of the earliest evidence of permanent architecture can be found, including stone walls and a massive tower whose construction required organised labour. These structures suggest not only the presence of settled communities, but also the ability to coordinate collective effort for shared defence and ritual. The wall and tower of Jericho may have served as protection against flooding or external threats, but they also symbolised permanence, the idea that humans could alter their environment in lasting ways. This was a crucial step toward the development of the later Canaanite city-states, for it showed that human communities in this region were beginning to master both their environment and the social organisation required to thrive within it. The Neolithic inhabitants of Canaan did not build their lives on architecture alone. They cultivated crops such as wheat and barley, legumes like lentils and peas, and they began to domesticate goats, sheep, and later cattle. The climate of the Levant, with its seasonal rains and fertile soils in valleys and plains, provided the conditions for such experiments. The shift to agriculture meant that people could generate surplus food, which in turn allowed for population growth and the development of social roles beyond mere subsistence. With food security came specialisation. individuals could devote time to crafts, to tool-making, to religious practices, and to forms of social organisation that extended beyond immediate family groups. The seeds of cultural complexity were sown in these early agricultural communities, and over centuries they would grow into the intricate societies known later as the Canaanites. Pottery, one of the hallmarks of Neolithic culture, appeared in the region during this period. Early ceramics were simple, functional vessels used for storing grain, water, and other necessities, but their significance went far beyond utility. Pottery represented an innovation that preserved surplus and made long-term storage possible, which in turn allowed for trade and exchange. Over time, designs grew more sophisticated, reflecting both aesthetic preferences and symbolic meanings. Decorations and patterns etched or painted onto pottery provide clues to the cultural and spiritual worlds of these early inhabitants. They reveal not only practical craftsmanship, but also an emerging sense of identity and community expression. The spread of pottery styles across different sites in Canaan shows that even in the Neolithic period, communities were connected through exchange networks that moved goods and ideas across considerable distances. The religious and symbolic dimensions of Neolithic life in Canaan can be glimpsed through figurines and ritual sites. Small clay figurines, often depicting female forms, suggest fertility cults or reverence for the generative forces of life. Such objects have been found in domestic contexts, indicating that ritual was not confined to communal spaces, but integrated into everyday existence. At some sites, archaeologists have found plastered human skulls, carefully reshaped and decorated, which may have represented ancestor veneration. These practices demonstrate an early awareness of continuity between the living and the dead, a theme that would persist throughout Canaanite religion in later centuries. By preserving and venerating the dead, early communities tied their identities to both place and lineage, laying the groundwork for the kinship-based social structures that would dominate the Bronze Age. The transition from the Neolithic into the Chalcolithic period, roughly 4500 to 3500 BCE, introduced new levels of complexity. The very name Chalcolithic means Copperstone Age, marking the time when stone tools remained widespread but were increasingly supplemented by the use of copper. This technological innovation was transformative. Copper tools offered advantages in durability and versatility, and their production required new forms of knowledge and organization. Mining, smelting, and casting copper demanded specialized skills, and these skills, once developed, became central to trade and social prestige. In Canaan, evidence from sites such as the Wadi Fainan copper mines in southern Jordan shows that communities were already experimenting with metallurgy during this period. The products of such work travelled widely, linking Canaanite communities into broader networks that stretched across the Near East. The Chalcolithic also saw the emergence of more elaborate ritual practices and communal organisation. At sites such as Tel Eilat Gassel near the Jordan Valley, archaeologists have uncovered large communal buildings, plastered floors, and intricate wall paintings. These features indicate the presence of ritual centres that may have drawn participants from surrounding settlements. The art of Tel Eilat Gassel includes geometric designs, animals, and possibly symbolic representations of deities or celestial phenomena. Such imagery suggests that religious thought was becoming more complex, moving beyond simple fertility cults to encompass broader cosmological ideas. The existence of communal ritual spaces also implies the rise of social hierarchies, for leaders or priestly figures must have organised and directed such activities. Burial practices in the Chalcolithic period became more elaborate as well. Ossuaries, stone or ceramic boxes used to hold the bones of the deceased, appear in significant numbers, decorated with geometric patterns or stylized human faces. These ossuaries reflect changing attitudes toward death and the afterlife, suggesting a belief in the continued presence of ancestors within the community. The effort invested in such burials indicates that social identity was deeply tied to lineage and collective memory. themes that would later manifest in Canaanite myths and genealogical traditions. Economically, the Chalcolithic period brought increasing specialization and integration into long-distance trade. The communities of Canaan produced olive oil, wine, and textiles that were exchanged with neighbouring regions. Exotic goods such as obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and shells from the Red Sea and Mediterranean reached Canaan, showing the remarkable extent of trade networks. These materials not only enriched local economies, but also introduced new ideas and cultural influences. The people of Canaan were not isolated farmers, but participants in a web of interaction that stretched across continents. Their role as intermediaries between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia foreshadowed their later importance as a land of trade and cultural exchange. The social fabric of Chalcolithic Canaan was dynamic and diverse. Settlements ranged from small villages to larger centres with evidence of social differentiation. Some households had access to luxury goods, while others did not, suggesting emerging class distinctions. Craft specialists such as potters, metalworkers, and weavers gained status through their skills, while leaders likely emerged to manage trade, defence, and ritual. These leaders did not yet command kingdoms, but they laid the groundwork for the political systems that would define the Bronze Age city-states. The combination of agriculture, craft specialisation, and trade created a vibrant society capable of sustaining larger populations and more complex institutions. One of the striking features of the Chalcolithic period in Canaan is the evidence of large-scale communal storage and economic organisation. At sites like Gilat in the Negev, archaeologists have discovered storage facilities and artefacts indicating centralised control of agricultural surplus. Such facilities suggest that leaders could collect, redistribute, and perhaps even tax the produce of their communities. This centralisation of resources represents an early step toward the formation of political authority that would later characterise the Canaanite kings and city rulers. The Neolithic and Chalcolithic roots of Canaanite civilization were thus marked by a combination of continuity and innovation. Agriculture, animal domestication, pottery, and ancestor worship established enduring traditions, while metallurgy, long-distance trade, and communal ritual introduced new dimensions of social complexity. These developments did not produce the Canaanites as they are later recognized, but they created the essential conditions for their emergence. By the end of the Chalcolithic period, the land of Canaan was dotted with settlements ranging from farming villages to proto-urban centres, all participating in regional and interregional exchange networks. The people of this era were no longer mere subsistence farmers. They were part of a cultural world that was increasingly interconnected and sophisticated. When the early Bronze Age began around 3300 BCE, the foundations laid in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods provided the stability and organisation necessary for the rise of true urbanism. The fortified towns, complex religious systems, and rich cultural traditions of the Canaanites would all find their roots in these earlier centuries, when human communities first transformed the land into a space of enduring settlement, innovation, and identity. As the 3rd millennium BCE unfolded, the scattered villages and proto-urban communities of Canaan began to take on new forms of organisation that would forever change the region. What had once been networks of agricultural hamlets and ritual centres grew into fortified cities that stood as hubs of trade, religion, and political power. Among the earliest and most prominent of these centres were Jericho, Hazor, and Byblos, 3 names that continue to resonate in archaeological and historical memory. These cities did not simply appear overnight. They were the product of generations of experimentation, adaptation, and expansion, each responding to its environment and its role within the larger web of Near Eastern civilization. Their rise represents the transformation of Canaan from a land of villages into a land of city-states, each one fiercely independent yet culturally connected to its neighbours. Jericho, with its deep prehistoric roots, was among the first to embody this shift. Long known as one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in the world, Jericho had already demonstrated remarkable resilience through its Neolithic walls and towers. By the early Bronze Age, the site evolved into a true city, fortified with massive stone structures that mark the increasing concern with defence and the ability of rulers to command large-scale labour forces. Excavations have revealed extensive mud brick walls, some over 5 metres thick, suggesting not only the fear of external threats, but also the prestige of monumental architecture. These fortifications may have served to protect valuable agricultural lands in the fertile Jordan Valley, where Jericho's inhabitants cultivated wheat, barley and dates. The surrounding oasis provided water and resources that sustained both the local population and passing traders. The city's location made it an essential stop on north-south and east-west trade routes. From Jericho, goods could flow toward the Jordan Valley, across the desert toward Mesopotamia, or down toward the Sinai and Egypt. This strategic position ensured that Jericho was more than a local stronghold. It was a node in the international networks that linked great powers. Its rulers, though not monarchs in the later sense, would have gained authority by controlling access to trade and redistributing wealth within the city. Archaeological evidence suggests social stratification, with elite households enjoying luxuries while common labourers lived more modestly. This inequality reflects the broader patterns of urban development in Canaan, where power increasingly concentrated in the hands of ruling families and their priestly allies. Hazor, located further north in the Upper Galilee, became one of the most significant Canaanite cities in both size and influence. By the Middle Bronze Age, Hazor was a sprawling metropolis, often called the head of all those kingdoms in later biblical references. Excavations reveal a city that covered over 200 acres, making it one of the largest in the region. Hazor's prominence stemmed from its strategic position on trade routes linking Mesopotamia, Anatolia and Egypt. Caravans bearing tin, copper, textiles and luxury goods passed through Hazor, enriching its elites and enabling the city to maintain monumental architecture and sophisticated administration. The wealth of Hazor is evident in its archaeological remains, which include palatial structures, temples, and massive fortifications built with Cyclopean stonework. Hazor's religious life also reflected its status as a central hub of Canaanite culture. Temples discovered at the site reveal cultic installations where offerings were made to the pantheon of deities, including El, Baal, and Asherah. The presence of imported goods in these religious contexts suggests that Hazor not only served as a centre of worship for locals, but also attracted pilgrims and merchants from afar, blending spiritual devotion with economic activity. Tablets written in Akkadian, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, have been discovered at Hazor, testifying to the city's involvement in international diplomacy. These records reveal correspondence between Hazor's rulers and foreign powers, highlighting the city's role as a political as well as economic powerhouse. Byblos, situated along the coast of modern Lebanon, provides yet another perspective on the rise of Canaanite city-states. Unlike inland Jericho and Hazor, Byblos owed its prosperity primarily to the sea. Its harbour, sheltered and naturally deep, made it one of the best on the eastern Mediterranean coast. Byblos became renowned for its trade in cedar wood, a resource abundant in the nearby mountains and highly valued in Egypt and Mesopotamia for shipbuilding and construction. Egyptian records from as early as the Old Kingdom, around 2600 BCE, mention Byblos as a source of timber and as a trading partner. The relationship between Byblos and Egypt grew so close that Egyptian goods, including alabaster vessels, scarabs and hieroglyphic inscriptions, have been found in the city's archaeological layers. The prosperity of Byblos rested on its role as an intermediary between Egypt and the Levant. Ships laden with cedar, wine, oil and resins sailed southward, while Egyptian gold, papyrus and luxury goods made their way north. This exchange enriched the city's ruling elite, who adorned themselves with imported finery and commissioned monumental buildings that blended local and Egyptian styles. The so-called Byblos syllabary, an early attempt at adapting Egyptian hieroglyphs to represent a Semitic language, emerged from this cultural interaction. Though not a fully developed alphabet, it foreshadowed the innovations in writing that would later spread from Canaan throughout the Mediterranean world. What Jericho, Hazor and Byblos shared, despite their different locations and emphases, was a pattern of urbanization that redefined the Canaanite world. Each city became a self-contained political entity, ruled by a local elite who commanded loyalty through a combination of military strength, religious authority, and control of trade. These rulers often presented themselves as mediators between the gods and the people, using temples and rituals to legitimize their power. The city itself became a sacred and political center, surrounded by villages and agricultural lands that supplied food and labor. Fortifications separated the urban core from the countryside, both protecting and emphasizing the status of those within. The rise of city-states also brought with it new forms of conflict. Competition between rival cities for trade routes, agricultural lands and prestige was constant. Fortified walls and elaborate defense systems reveal the expectation of warfare, and texts from neighboring powers confirm that Canaanite rulers frequently engaged in both alliance and betrayal. The Amarna letters, written in the 14th century BCE, contain numerous appeals from Canaanite rulers to the Egyptian pharaoh, complaining of rival kings or encroaching enemies. These letters depict a fragmented landscape in which no single city dominated, but rather dozens of small polities struggled for advantage under the shadow of larger empires. The social structure within these cities reflected both continuity with earlier traditions and adaptation to new urban realities. Kinship groups remained important, but authority increasingly resided in the hands of ruling dynasties who controlled temples and palaces. Priests and scribes served these elites, recording transactions, maintaining rituals, and advising rulers. Merchants gained wealth through trade, while artisans produced pottery, metalwork, textiles, and other goods that supported both daily life and long-distance exchange. Farmers and labourers formed the base of society, their work sustaining the grandeur of city life. This hierarchy was visible not only in living arrangements, but also in burial practices, with elite tombs filled with jewellery, weapons, and imported goods, while common graves contained far more modest offerings. Religious practice was central to the identity of these city-states. The gods of Canaan, El, the creator, Baal, the storm and fertility god, Asherah, the mother goddess, and others, were worshipped in temples that dominated the urban landscape. Rituals of sacrifice, festivals, and offerings reinforced the authority of both gods and rulers, linking divine order with human politics. Each city had its own patron deities, but the broader pantheon created a shared cultural framework that bound the Canaanite world together. The myths and epics that emerged from places like Ugarit, though slightly later, reflect traditions that were already present in these cities, embedding the experiences of agriculture, fertility, war and kingship in narratives of cosmic significance. The material culture of Jericho, Hazor and Byblos also illustrates the distinct yet interconnected character of Canaanite urbanism. Pottery styles, architectural techniques and artistic motifs varied from city to city, yet common elements reveal a shared cultural horizon. The use of mud brick for construction, the layout of palaces and temples, and the decorative styles of jewellery and weaponry point to a civilization that, though fragmented politically, shared fundamental traditions. The widespread distribution of Canaanite pottery across the Levant and beyond demonstrates both the productivity of these cities and their integration into larger economic systems. The rise of these cities did not occur in isolation. Each was shaped by contact with neighbouring great powers. Egyptian influence is evident in Byblos through inscriptions and trade goods. Mesopotamian influence appears in Hazor through Akkadian tablets and artistic motifs. Jericho reflects local traditions adapted to long-standing trade routes. This constant exposure to foreign cultures enriched Canaanite civilization, giving it a cosmopolitan character even in its formative stages. Yet the Canaanites also maintained their distinct identity, speaking their own language, worshipping their own gods, and developing innovations such as early alphabetic writing that would influence the world beyond their borders. The transformation from villages to city-states marked a turning point in Canaanite history. These cities embodied the balance between continuity and change, rooted in Neolithic and Chalcolithic traditions but transformed by the demands of urban life, trade, and diplomacy. They set the stage for the political, cultural, and religious developments that would define the Canaanite world in the centuries to come. The struggles, alliances, and achievements of Jericho, Hazor, and Byblos were not isolated episodes, but part of a larger story of how human communities in the Levant adapted to their environment and to the pressures of a world in constant motion. From these beginnings of urban life, the narrative of Canaan expands further into the religious and cultural systems that sustained these cities and the deities who embodied their values, shaping both daily life and the broader identity of the Canaanite people. Religion formed the backbone of Canaanite society, shaping the way its people understood their world, their politics, and their daily lives. To walk into a Canaanite city such as Hazor, Byblos, Megiddo, or Ugarit was to encounter a landscape dominated by sacred spaces. Temples stood at the heart of urban centres, their walls rising above common houses, their courtyards filled with altars, and their chambers adorned with offerings to the gods. From the earliest days of urban development in Canaan, religion was not a separate sphere but the central organising principle of existence. It permeated governance, agriculture, trade, and family life. The divine realm was believed to mirror the human realm, with assemblies of gods resembling councils of kings and chiefs. To understand the Canaanites is to understand the intricate web of gods, temples, and sacred practices that bound their world together. The pantheon of Canaan was vast and layered, but certain deities stood at its core. At the head was El, the high god whose name simply meant God in the Semitic language of the region. El was depicted as a patriarchal figure, wise and eternal, dwelling in a distant abode but presiding over the assembly of gods. He was the father of the divine family, the one who granted authority and decreed destinies. Unlike the more dynamic gods of storm or fertility, El embodied stability and permanence, representing the overarching order of the cosmos. His authority was not often contested in myth, and his role as father of gods and mortals reflected the patriarchal structures of Canaanite society itself. Alongside El stood Baal, the storm god who embodied fertility, rain, and the cycles of life and death tied to agriculture. Where El was distant, Baal was immediate. He was the bringer of rain that nourished the fields, the god whose thunder announced both his presence and the fertility of the land. Baal was also a warrior deity, often depicted wielding a mace or thunderbolt, standing upon a bull that symbolized strength and vitality. Myths recorded at Ugarit describe Baal's battles against the forces of chaos, particularly the sea god Yam and the death god Mot. These stories, while mythological, expressed the fundamental concerns of Canaanite farmers whose livelihoods depended on the arrival of seasonal rains and the triumph of fertility over drought. Baal's cult was widespread, and his temples were central to Canaanite urban life. Asherah, the great mother goddess, complemented El and Baal within the pantheon. She was associated with fertility, motherhood, and the generative powers of nature. Represented in inscriptions as Athirat, she was sometimes described as the consort of El and at other times as the mother of the gods. Asherah was worshipped through wooden poles or sacred trees, often placed near altars or within temple precincts. Archaeological finds, including figurines depicting a female form with emphasized breasts, suggest her widespread veneration among common households, as well as within formal temple worship. For the Canaanites, Asherah represented the continuity of life, the nurturing power of the earth, and the presence of divinity within the rhythms of fertility and childbirth. Other deities filled the pantheon, each with their own roles and spheres of influence. Anat, a warrior goddess and sister of Baal, embodied ferocity and protection. In myths, she is depicted as a defender of Baal, slaughtering his enemies with unstoppable force. A starter linked with love, war and sexuality, shared qualities with Anat but carried her own distinct cult following. Yam, the sea god, represented the ever-present dangers of the Mediterranean and the chaos of uncontrolled waters. Mot, the god of death, symbolized the barren season, drought, and the inevitable cycle of mortality. Shamash, the sun god, provided light and justice, witnessing human deeds and ensuring the order of both cosmos and society. Reshef, a god of plague and war, reflected the harsh realities of disease and conflict. Together, these deities formed a pantheon that spoke directly to the experiences of the people, from the cycles of the natural world to the uncertainties of politics and war. The Canaanite gods were not distant abstractions, but living presences who demanded offerings, sacrifices, and rituals to maintain harmony. Temples were the physical centres where these relationships were enacted. Excavations at sites such as Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, and Ugarit have revealed temple complexes that varied in form but shared common elements. Many were built on raised platforms, symbolically connecting earth and heaven. Courtyards with altars allowed for public sacrifices, while inner sanctuaries housed cult statues or sacred symbols representing the deity. The walls were often thick and massive, signalling both sacred protection and the wealth of the city that supported them. Within these temples, priests conducted rituals that sustained the bond between gods and humans, offering food, incense, drink, and blood sacrifices to ensure divine favour. Animal sacrifice was a central act of Canaanite worship. Sheep, goats, bulls, and birds were slaughtered on altars, their blood seen as pleasing to the gods and their flesh often shared in communal meals. These sacrifices were not simply gestures of devotion, but acts of negotiation, maintaining the balance of life and seeking the blessing of rain, fertility, and protection. Inscriptions and texts suggest that offerings of wine, oil, grain, and incense accompanied animal sacrifices, creating a symphony of sensory experiences, smoke rising into the sky, flames consuming flesh, fragrant scents filling the air that reinforced the sense of divine presence. Human sacrifice, though more controversial, appears to have had a place within certain Canaanite rituals, particularly in times of crisis. References in later sources, including biblical texts, describe the offering of children to deities like Molech, a figure associated with fire and underworld powers. Archaeological evidence remains debated, but some finds, such as urns containing infant remains at Carthage, a later Phoenician colony rooted in Canaanite tradition, suggest that such practices did occur. Whether widespread or exceptional, the possibility of human sacrifice reflects the depth of devotion and desperation that could characterize Canaanite religious life, particularly when communities faced existential threats from drought, famine, or invasion. Household religion coexisted with public temple worship. While priests conducted elaborate rituals in the city's temples, families maintained their own altars and figurines in their homes. Archaeologists have found numerous clay figurines of female deities, often interpreted as household representations of Asherah. Such objects suggest that ordinary Canaanites saw the divine not only in grand temples but also in the intimate space of the household. Domestic shrines, offering bowls and small incense stands indicate that families engaged in daily rituals to secure fertility, health, and protection. This blending of public and private devotion reveals the pervasive role of religion in every aspect of life. Priests played a crucial role in maintaining the link between humans and gods. They were custodians of rituals, keepers of temple property, and interpreters of divine will. Their authority derived not only from their control of sacred knowledge, but also from their economic power, for temples were major landholders and economic centres. Agricultural surplus flowed into temple granaries, herds of animals were raised for sacrifice, and workshops within temple precincts produced goods ranging from textiles to metalwork. The temple was thus both a religious and an economic hub, sustaining priests and their households, while redistributing wealth through festivals and rituals. Festivals formed another essential component of Canaanite religion. Seasonal rituals marked the cycles of planting, harvest, and renewal. One of the most significant was the celebration of Baal's victory over Mot, symbolising the return of fertility after the dry season. These festivals involved processions, music, feasting, and communal sacrifice, reinforcing both religious devotion and social cohesion. They also provided opportunities for rulers to display their piety and generosity, strengthening their legitimacy by demonstrating alignment with divine will. In cities like Ugarit, the liturgical texts recovered from temple archives describe hymns, prayers, and rituals performed during these festivals, offering a glimpse into the rhythm of sacred life that structured the year. The myths of the Canaanites, preserved most fully in the Ugaritic texts discovered at Ras Shamra, reveal the theological foundations of their religious practices. The Baal cycle, a series of epics recounting the struggles of Baal against Yam and Mot, dramatizes the seasonal cycles of fertility and drought. In these stories, Baal's temporary death at the hands of Mot represents the withering of the land during the dry season, while his return to life marks the renewal of rains and agricultural abundance. Anat's fierce loyalty to Baal, including her violent destruction of his enemies, underscores the themes of protection and regeneration. These myths were not mere entertainment. They were theological reflections of natural cycles, legitimizing rituals that sought to ensure the continuation of life. The sacred architecture of Canaanite temples also reflected cosmological ideas. Ziggurat-like platforms, though not as massive as those of Mesopotamia, raised the temple above the surrounding landscape, symbolizing the meeting point between heaven and earth. Within the inner sanctum, cult statues embodied the presence of the gods. These statues were not merely symbolic, they were treated as living beings, clothed, fed, and anointed daily. Rituals of washing, dressing, and feeding the statues reinforced the belief that the gods dwelled within these physical forms, accepting the offerings of their devotees. To neglect the cult statue was to risk divine anger and the withdrawal of blessing. Divination formed another important practice within Canaanite religion. Priests and specialists interpreted omens, dreams, and celestial phenomena to discern the will of the gods. The movement of the stars, the patterns of animal entrails, and the behaviour of birds could all be read as signs. These practices linked the Canaanites to broader Near Eastern traditions of divination, where the cosmos was seen as a text to be interpreted. Kings relied on such interpretations for decisions about war, diplomacy, and construction, seeking assurance that their actions aligned with divine will. Religion was not static, but evolved over time, influenced by contact with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Egyptian inscriptions found in Byblos reveal that Egyptian gods were venerated alongside Canaanite deities, and Egyptian pharaohs claimed divine approval for their interactions with the city. In Ugarit, Mesopotamian influences can be seen in the adoption of Akkadian writing for administrative and ritual purposes, yet the Canaanites maintained their own distinctive religious traditions, adapting foreign elements while preserving their core pantheon and practices. The integration of religion into politics was perhaps the most defining feature of Canaanite society. Kings presented themselves as chosen by the gods, ruling not only by force but also by divine mandate. Temples functioned as symbols of legitimacy, and rulers invested heavily in their maintenance and expansion. Victory in battle was attributed to divine favour, while defeat was interpreted as punishment for neglecting the gods. This worldview ensured that religion was inseparable from governance, binding the fate of the city to the favour of its patron deities. The Canaanite religious world was rich, complex, and deeply rooted in the realities of daily life. Its gods embodied the forces of nature and society, Its temples dominated the urban landscape, and its rituals structured both the agricultural calendar and the political order. In every household figurine, in every temple sacrifice, in every myth recited at festival, the Canaanites expressed their understanding of a world where the divine and human were inseparably intertwined. From this religious foundation, the story of Canaan moves further into the character of the pantheon itself, where the figures of Baal, El, Asherah, Anat and others emerge not merely as names but as dynamic personalities shaping the destiny of both gods and mortals. At the centre of Canaanite religion stood three deities whose roles and relationships define the spiritual worldview of the people. El, the high god, Baal, the stormbringer and fertility lord, and Asherah, the great mother goddess. Around them clustered a host of other divine figures, but it was their presence that anchored the pantheon and gave shape to the mythological and ritual life of Canaan. These three were not abstract ideas, but living forces in the imagination of the people, invoked in prayers, honoured in temples, and represented in myths that explain the cycles of life, death, and renewal. To understand the Canaanite pantheon is to begin with these deities, for their roles illuminate both the structure of divine authority and the values of the society that worshipped them. El occupied the highest position, an ancient god whose authority derived from age, wisdom, and fatherhood. The very name El meant God in the Semitic languages of the region, and inscriptions across the Levant bear testimony to his pervasive role. He was envisioned as a patriarch, often described as bearded, enthroned, and dwelling in a remote abode on the cosmic heights, sometimes imagined as a mountain or the sources of rivers. El did not frequently intervene in the affairs of mortals or even other gods, for his power was expressed less in action than in decree. He was the one who presided over the divine council, a gathering of gods who debated and decided matters of cosmic importance. Just as Canaanite city-states were ruled by assemblies of elders and chiefs, so too the cosmos was governed by a divine assembly presided over by El. This parallel between human and divine governance reinforced the idea that political order mirrored heavenly order, and that legitimacy flowed from the structure embodied by El's authority. In mythological texts from Ugarit, El appears as a benevolent yet somewhat distant figure, granting kingship to Baal, mediating disputes among the gods, and ensuring that cosmic order endured. His epithets included Father of Humanity and Creator of Creatures, highlighting his role as the progenitor not only of the divine family but also of mortals. The stability El represented was crucial in a world where political fortunes rose and fell, where reigns might come or fail, and where life was fragile. He was the symbol of permanence, the god who stood above change. If El was the stable patriarch, Baal was the dynamic force of life itself. His name simply meant Lord, and his domain was the storm, the rains, and the fertility of the land. For the Canaanites, who lived in a climate of dry summers and unpredictable rainfall, Baal's presence or absence determined survival. When rains came in season, crops thrived, herds fattened, and life flourished. When rains failed, famine and hardship spread. It is no surprise, then, that Baal became the focus of some of the most elaborate rituals and myths of the Canaanite world. The Baal cycle, preserved in Ugaritic tablets, recounts his struggles with other deities that symbolize forces of chaos and death. His battle with Yam, the god of the sea, represents the conflict between order and chaos, between fertile land and destructive waters. Baal defeats Yam with weapons crafted by the divine artisan Kuthawakasis, establishing his supremacy and securing his place as king of the gods under El's authority. This victory reflects not only mythological themes, but also the realities of Canaanite life, where the sea was both a source of trade and a symbol of uncontrollable danger. Yet Baal's rule was not secure. He later faced Mot, the god of death and sterility, whose domain threatened to engulf Baal and bring about famine. In the myth, Baal is swallowed by Mot, and his absence brings drought and desolation to the land. Only through the intervention of Anat, Baal's sister, and fierce ally, is Baal restored to life, triumphant once again, bringing rain and fertility back to the earth. This mythic cycle mirrored the agricultural cycle, the dry season when the land withers, the rains that return with renewed life, and the eternal struggle between life and death. To the Canaanites, Baal's story was not distant myth, but an explanation of their lived reality, reenacted annually in rituals that sought to secure his return and the renewal of fertility. Baal's worship was widespread, with temples dedicated to him in cities across Canaan. Excavations at Ugarit have uncovered large sanctuaries devoted to him, with altars for sacrifice and courtyards for public rituals. He was represented iconographically as a powerful figure wielding a mace or thunderbolt, often standing upon a bull, the animal that symbolized strength and virility. Offerings to Baal included not only animals but also agricultural produce and libations, reflecting his role as the giver of abundance. Rituals of lamentation may have accompanied the myth of his death, followed by celebrations of joy at his return, binding the community's hopes for fertility directly to the divine drama. Complementing El and Baal was Asherah, the mother goddess whose presence permeated both public temples and private households. Known also as Atharat in Ugaritic texts, she was depicted as the mother of 70 gods, a symbol of fertility, nurturance, and continuity. Asherah embodied the generative forces of life, not only in agriculture but also in human reproduction and social stability. She was often represented through wooden poles or stylized trees set up near altars, symbols of life and growth. Figurines of a female form with prominent breasts found in large numbers throughout the Levant are thought to represent Asherah and suggest that her worship extended deeply into the daily lives of ordinary Canaanites. Asherah's role within the pantheon was complex. In some traditions, she appears as the consort of El, the motherly counterpart to the paternal figure of the high god. In others, she is associated with Baal, emphasizing the fertility that comes from the union of storm and earth. This fluidity reflects the flexible nature of Canaanite religion, where deities could occupy multiple roles and relationships depending on context. Asherah was invoked for fertility of the womb, fertility of the field, and protection of family and household. Her symbols appear not only in temple precincts but also in domestic shrines, demonstrating her centrality in both public and private devotion. The triad of El, Baal, and Asherah structured much of the religious imagination of the Canaanites. El represented order and stability, Baal represented vitality and renewal, and Asherah represented nurture and continuity. Together they embodied the fundamental concerns of human life in Canaan, the need for stability and governance, the necessity of rain and fertility for survival, and the continuity of family and community across generations. This triad did not exist in isolation, for the pantheon was filled with other gods and goddesses, each contributing to the richness of the religious world. Anat's ferocity, Astarte's sensuality, Mot's inevitability, and Yam's chaos all found their place within the larger cosmic drama. But El, Baal, and Asherah stood at the centre, shaping the religious life of Canaan and anchoring its rituals and myths. The relationship between these deities and the people was not one of passive worship, but of active negotiation. Sacrifices, prayers, and festivals were ways of maintaining the favour of the gods, ensuring that rain would fall, crops would grow, families would prosper, and enemies would be defeated. Temples served as the theatres of this negotiation, where priests mediated between human needs and divine will. Festivals dedicated to Baal's resurrection or Asherah's fertility reinforced the mythological narratives that gave meaning to the cycles of life. Kings and rulers tied their legitimacy to these deities, presenting themselves as chosen and favoured by them, aligning human authority with divine order. The myths of El, Baal, and Asherah reveal not only theological ideas but also the social structures of the Canaanites. The patriarchal authority of El mirrored the role of elders and rulers within city-states. The dynamic struggles of Baal reflected the uncertainties of agricultural life, with its dependence on unpredictable rains and its cycles of abundance and scarcity. The maternal presence of Asherah reflected the central role of family, fertility and continuity in a society where survival depended on both lineage and labour. In this sense, the pantheon was both a reflection of human society and a framework that gave meaning to it. Archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate the prominence of these deities. Inscriptions invoking El, Baal and Asherah have been found in temples and on household objects. Reliefs depict Baal in his warrior stance, while figurines of Asherah abound in domestic contexts. The presence of these deities in both elite and common settings underscores their centrality in every level of society. Even as external powers such as Egypt exerted influence over Canaan, the local pantheon retained its vitality, shaping how the people understood their world and their place within it. The interplay between El, Baal and Asherah represents more than myth. It represents the lived religion of the Canaanites, expressed in offerings, rituals, myths, and symbols. Their presence defined the religious landscape of Canaan, anchoring a complex pantheon and providing a framework through which human communities engaged with the forces of nature, society, and the cosmos. From this divine triad, the narrative of Canaanite life continues outward into the daily practices of the people, where agriculture, trade, and domestic worlds intertwined with ritual and devotion, ensuring that every act of survival was also an act of reverence to the gods who govern their fate. The life of the Canaanites was defined not only by their gods and rulers, but by the rhythms of daily existence, the cycles of planting and harvest, the labour of trade, and the intimate world of family and home. Beneath the monumental temples and the political struggles of the city-states, the ordinary lives of men, women and children created the fabric of Canaanite society. Archaeology and written records provide glimpses into these worlds, showing how people sustained themselves, how they organised their labour, and how they found meaning in the ordinary tasks of survival. Agriculture, trade, and domestic life were not separate spheres, but deeply intertwined, each reinforcing the other and together sustaining the civilization that flourished across the Levant. Agriculture formed the foundation of Canaanite life. The land offered a varied environment, from fertile valleys like the Jezreel and the Jordan to rugged hillsides and coastal plains. Farmers adapted to these different terrains, cultivating wheat, barley, olives, figs, grapes, and lentils. The cycles of planting and harvest were dictated by the rains, which made the worship of Baal, the storm god, so central to their religion. Oxen drew wooden ploughs through the soil, while sickles of flint or bronze harvested the crops. Grain was threshed, winnowed, and stored in clay jars or communal granaries, ensuring a supply for times of scarcity. Wine and oil, products of grape and olive cultivation, became staples of diet and trade, their production requiring specialised presses and storage facilities. The agricultural year was punctuated by festivals and rituals designed to secure divine favour, making farming both an economic and a religious act. Livestock also played a vital role. Goats, sheep and cattle provided milk, meat, wool and hides, while donkeys served as beasts of burden in both agriculture and trade. Herding required seasonal movement, with shepherds guiding their flocks to pastures in the hills during one part of the year and returning to the valleys during another. This semi-nomadic aspect of Canaanite life linked the settled farmers of villages and towns with the pastoralists who roamed the less fertile regions. The exchange between these groups ensured a diversity of products, with grain moving toward herding communities and animal goods flowing into the towns. Such interactions created interdependence that strengthened the overall economy of Canaan. Fishing and hunting supplemented agriculture and herding. Along the Mediterranean coast, fishing was a steady occupation, with nets, hooks and harpoons providing access to abundant resources. Inland rivers and lakes, including the Sea of Galilee, supported local fishing economies. Hunting, though less central, offered meat and hides as well as prestige for those who succeeded in capturing larger animals. These supplementary activities ensured dietary diversity and contributed to the symbolic associations of certain animals within Canaanite religion and art. Trade was the second pillar of Canaanite life, linking agriculture and production to broader networks that extended far beyond the Levant. The strategic position of Canaan, bridging Mesopotamia, Anatolia and Egypt, made it a vital corridor for merchants and caravans. Canaanite cities such as Byblos, Sidon and Tyre became famous for their role as trade hubs, with harbours that facilitated maritime commerce and inland routes that connected them to desert caravans. Cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon was perhaps the most famous export, prized in Egypt and Mesopotamia for construction and shipbuilding. Wine, olive oil, textiles, and purple dye made from murex shells were other highly valued goods that travelled outward from Canaan. In return, Canaanites imported luxury items that reflected their integration into international trade. Gold from Egypt, silver from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and ivory from Africa reached Canaanite markets. Pottery styles show influences from Cyprus, Crete and Mycenaean Greece, indicating contacts with the Aegean world. Egyptian scarabs, alabaster jars and hieroglyphic inscriptions found in Canaanite cities testify to long-standing relationships with the Nile Valley. These exchanges were not limited to goods, but included ideas, technologies, and cultural practices, giving Canaanite life a cosmopolitan character. Merchants played an important role in the system. Some travelled long distances with caravans, enduring the dangers of deserts and mountains to bring back exotic wares. Others specialised in maritime trade, navigating the Mediterranean in ships laden with timber and oil. Markets within the cities bustled with activity, as local farmers and craftsmen exchanged their products for imported goods. Such markets were centres of social life as well as commerce, places where news was exchanged, alliances forged, and the pulse of the community felt. Inscriptions and archaeological finds reveal weights, measures, and seals that regulated trade, reflecting a system of accountability and trust necessary for complex exchanges. Craft production formed a bridge between agriculture and trade. Potters, weavers, metalworkers, and carpenters transformed raw materials into finished goods for both domestic use and export. Pottery was produced in standardized shapes for storage, cooking, and transport, often decorated with geometric designs or motifs drawn from nature. Textiles were woven from wool and flax, dyed in vibrant colours, and sometimes embroidered with intricate patterns. Metalworkers fashioned tools, weapons and jewellery from copper, bronze and later iron, while carpenters built furniture, wagons and ships. These crafts were essential to daily life, but also contributed to the wealth and reputation of Canaanite cities in international trade. The domestic world of the Canaanites reflected both simplicity and complexity. Houses were typically built of mud brick, arranged around courtyards that formed the centre of family life. In these courtyards, cooking was done on open hearths, weaving and pottery production took place, and animals were sometimes kept. Rooms opened onto the courtyard, serving as sleeping quarters, storage spaces and workshops. Larger houses with multiple rooms and more elaborate layouts indicate the presence of wealthier families, while smaller, simpler dwellings housed the majority. The arrangement of homes within neighbourhoods created tight-knit communities where extended families often lived in close proximity. Family life was structured around kinship, with patriarchal authority dominating. Fathers held legal and social control, while women managed households, raised children, and participated in agricultural and craft labour. Evidence suggests that women also played roles in religious life, as priestesses and participants in household rituals, particularly those associated with fertility and childbirth. Children contributed to the household economy from an early age, learning skills necessary for survival and gradually taking on adult responsibilities. The emphasis on family continuity is reflected in burial practices, with ancestors interred beneath or near houses, maintaining the connection between the living and the dead. Food and diet reveal much about daily life. Bread made from wheat or barley was the staple, accompanied by olives, figs, dates, lentils, and seasonal vegetables. Meat from sheep, goats, and cattle was consumed less frequently, often reserved for festivals or sacrifices, while fish provided a steady source of protein along the coast and inland lakes. Wine was a common beverage, consumed daily but also central to ritual and festival life. Olive oil served both as food and as fuel for lamps, illuminating homes after sunset. These staples not only sustained life but also created cultural identity, binding Canaanites to the land and its produce. Social stratification was evident even within domestic life. Wealthier households enjoyed access to imported goods, elaborate jewellery and finely crafted furniture, while poorer families lived more modestly. Elite families often had larger burial chambers filled with grave goods, including bronze weapons, gold ornaments and imported pottery. The distinction between rich and poor was visible in the architecture of homes, the quality of possessions and the scale of burial offerings. Yet even among the less wealthy, domestic life held dignity and continuity, grounded in the same rhythms of agriculture, trade and devotion. Education and literacy, though limited, played a role in urban centres. Scribes trained in Akkadian cuneiform recorded diplomatic correspondence, economic transactions and religious texts. These scribes were often attached to royal courts or temples, serving both practical and religious functions. In Ugarit, an early alphabetic script developed, simplifying writing and making it more accessible. While literacy was confined to elites, its presence reveals the intellectual vitality of Canaanite society and its role in connecting Canaan to the wider literate world of the Near East. Music and entertainment also formed part of daily life. Instruments such as lyres, flutes, and drums accompanied festivals, rituals, and domestic gatherings. Songs preserved myths, celebrated victories, and expressed laments. Dancing and storytelling provided communal entertainment, reinforcing cultural values and passing traditions across generations. Such practices reveal that Canaanite life, while shaped by labour and survival, also contained moments of joy, creativity and expression. The integration of agriculture, trade and domestic life created a resilient society capable of withstanding external pressures and internal challenges. Each sphere reinforced the others. Agriculture provided food for households and goods for trade. Trade brought wealth and new ideas into the domestic world. Family and kinship provided the labour and continuity necessary to sustain both fields and markets. Religion permeated all three spheres, with rituals tied to planting and harvest, offerings made in markets and temples, and household shrines ensuring divine protection within the home. The texture of everyday life in Canaan was thus both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that it revolved around familiar human concerns, food, shelter, family, work, and extraordinary in the way these concerns were embedded in a broader religious and cultural system that gave meaning to every action. A loaf of bread was not just food but the product of divine blessing. A trade caravan was not just commerce, but a link in a chain that bound Canaan to the powers of the world. A household courtyard was not just a domestic space, but a site where ancestors were honoured and gods invoked. From the daily labour of farmers, merchants, artisans and families emerged the strength of Canaanite civilization. These lives, often invisible in the records of kings and temples, formed the foundation upon which political power and religious authority rested. Without the rhythms of agriculture, the networks of trade, and the intimacy of domestic worlds, the grandeur of Canaanite temples and the myths of their gods could not have endured. From this grounding in daily life, the story of the Canaanites flows naturally into their role as innovators and transmitters of knowledge, most notably their development of the alphabet, a contribution that would echo far beyond their own time and place. The story of writing in the ancient Near East begins with the great systems of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where cuneiform and hieroglyphs emerged as powerful tools of administration, religion, and culture. Both of these systems, however, were highly complex, requiring years of training for scribes to master hundreds of characters. They were effective for large states with centralized bureaucracies, but they placed literacy firmly in the hands of a narrow elite. In the land of Canaan, positioned between these two civilizations, a new approach to writing gradually took shape, one that simplified the recording of language and would ultimately transform communication across the world. The invention of the alphabet, attributed to Canaanite scribes and merchants, represents one of the most enduring contributions of this culture, an innovation that would spread across the Mediterranean and lay the foundation for modern writing systems. The roots of this development can be traced to the environment in which the Canaanites lived. As intermediaries between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, they were constantly exposed to different scripts and languages. Egyptian hieroglyphs reached the coastal cities of Byblos and Sidon through trade and diplomatic ties, while cuneiform was used in correspondence with Mesopotamia and in international treaties. Akkadian, written in cuneiform, served as the lingua franca of diplomacy during the Late Bronze Age, and Canaanite scribes were skilled in its use, as shown by the Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic texts written by Canaanite rulers to the Egyptian pharaoh. But while these systems served political and diplomatic needs, they were not practical for broader use in trade or everyday affairs. The complexity of cuneiform, with its wedge-shaped signs, and the pictorial nature of hieroglyphs limited their accessibility. It was in this context that Canaanite scribes began to experiment with simplifying the relationship between symbols and sounds. Instead of representing entire words or syllables with hundreds of characters, they focused on reducing writing to a set of signs representing individual consonantal sounds. This system, sometimes called a consonantal alphabet or abjad, required far fewer characters, perhaps as few as 22, and could be learned much more easily than cuneiform or hieroglyphs. The principle was revolutionary. By assigning a single sign to each sound, scribes could record any word in their spoken language with a small, consistent set of symbols. The earliest evidence of this innovation comes from the region of Sinai, particularly the inscriptions at Serabit el-Kadim, a turquoise mining site controlled by Egypt but worked by Canaanite labourers. These inscriptions, dating to around the 19th or 18th century BCE, display simplified hieroglyphic signs adapted to represent the sounds of a Semitic language. Scholars believe these inscriptions reflect the earliest stages of alphabetic writing, created by Canaanites familiar with Egyptian symbols but seeking a simpler way to record their own language. The signs are crude compared to the refined hieroglyphs, but their importance lies in their principle. They represent sounds, not pictures. This was the seed of the alphabet. From Sinai, the idea spread back into the cities of Canaan, where it developed further into recognizable alphabetic scripts. By the 15th and 14th centuries BCE, inscriptions found at sites such as Lachish and Giza show the use of linear alphabetic writing. These early scripts were still inconsistent with variations in the forms of letters, but they reveal a clear shift toward the systematic use of a reduced set of symbols. The Canaanites, as traders and seafarers, had both the need and the opportunity to spread this innovation. Merchants travelling across the Mediterranean could carry the script with them, teaching others its simple principles. Unlike cuneiform, which required years of training, the alphabet could be learned relatively quickly, making it an ideal tool for traders, artisans, and administrators who needed a practical means of recording transactions. Byblos, long a hub of interaction with Egypt, played a particularly important role in this process. Inscriptions found there reveal experimentation with alphabetic writing, blending Egyptian influence with Semitic language structures. The so-called Byblos syllabary, though not a true alphabet, represents an intermediate step, showing how local scribes adapted foreign models to their own needs. Over time, these experiments crystallized into the Phoenician alphabet, a standardized set of 22 characters that represented consonantal sounds. Though the fully developed Phoenician script belongs to the early 1st millennium BCE, its roots in Canaanite innovation are clear. The significance of the alphabet cannot be overstated. By simplifying writing, the Canaanites democratized literacy in ways that cuneiform and hieroglyphs never could. While it is unlikely that every Canaanite became literate, the barrier to learning was greatly reduced. Merchants could keep records, contracts could be written more easily, and religious texts could be copied and transmitted without requiring the full training of a professional scribe. The alphabet's portability and efficiency made it an ideal vehicle for communication across the diverse and multilingual world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological finds continue to shed light on this process. At Ugarit, a Canaanite city on the northern coast, scribes developed an alphabetic cuneiform script around the 14th century BCE. Unlike the linear alphabets of the south, this system used wedge-shaped signs pressed into clay tablets, but retained the principle of representing consonantal sounds with a limited set of symbols. The Ugaritic alphabet contained 30 letters, including signs for vowels, and it coexisted alongside traditional cuneiform for international correspondence. The survival of Ugaritic texts provides extraordinary insights into Canaanite religion, myth, and daily life, showing how alphabetic writing could be used to preserve extensive literary traditions. The spread of the alphabet beyond Canaan illustrates the broader impact of this invention. By the early 1st millennium BCE, the Phoenician script, derived from Canaanite models, was carried by seafarers across the Mediterranean. It reached Cyprus, Greece, and eventually Italy, where it influenced the development of the Greek alphabet, and, through it, the Latin script that underlies much of modern writing. The Canaanite invention thus became the foundation for alphabets used today, from Arabic and Hebrew to Greek, Latin, and Cyrillic. What began as a practical tool for traders and scribes in Canaan transformed global communication, shaping the way languages recorded across continents and centuries. The cultural implications of the alphabet within Canaan itself were profound. By making writing more accessible, it allowed for a greater preservation of religious traditions, myths, and legal codes. Though much has been lost, the survival of Ugaritic texts demonstrates how alphabetic writing enabled the recording of complex literary and theological material. Hymns to Baal, epics involving Anat and El, and ritual instructions for festivals have been preserved in alphabetic form, providing a window into the spiritual life of the Canaanites. Without the invention of the alphabet, much of this material might have remained oral and been lost to history. The invention also changed the role of scribes. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, scribes formed a closed professional class, their expertise giving them immense prestige. In Canaan, the alphabet's simplicity reduced the exclusivity of literacy, though trained scribes still played important roles in diplomacy and temple administration. The presence of alphabetic inscriptions on pottery, ostraca, and everyday objects suggests that writing permeated more levels of society than in neighbouring cultures. Graffiti carved on walls or scratched onto vessels shows that writing was not confined to palaces and temples, but was part of the broader social landscape. The alphabet's invention must also be seen in the context of Canaanite identity. Positioned between empires, the Canaanites were often overshadowed politically, their city-states subject to Egyptian, Hittite, or Mesopotamian domination at various times. Yet, in the realm of culture, they made a contribution that outlasted those empires. The alphabet became their legacy, a quiet revolution that reshaped human communication. While their cities might rise and fall, their gods might be supplanted by new religions, and their political independence might wane, the alphabet endured, spreading outward until it became the dominant mode of writing in much of the world. This innovation did not erase earlier traditions, but complemented them. Akkadian cuneiform continued to be used for international correspondence. Egyptian hieroglyphs remained the language of pharaonic inscriptions. But within the towns and markets of Canaan, the alphabet found fertile ground. It fit the needs of a society deeply involved in trade, accustomed to adaptation and eager for practical solutions. The Canaanites were not inventors in isolation, but experimenters responding to their environment, blending elements of foreign scripts with their own linguistic needs, until something new and transformative emerged. The role of the alphabet in shaping the identity of later peoples cannot be ignored. The Israelites, whose earliest texts were written in scripts derived from Canaanite models, inherited this system and used it to record traditions that would become central to Judaism and Christianity. The Phoenicians, heirs of Canaanite cities along the coast, carried the script across the seas, spreading it to cultures that adapted and transformed it. In this way, the Canaanite invention transcended its origins, embedding itself in the cultural DNA of civilizations far beyond the Levant. The invention of the alphabet was therefore not only a technological milestone but a cultural turning point. It reflected the practical needs of Canaanite society, trade, communication, administration, and at the same time it embodied the spirit of adaptation and innovation that characterized the people. The alphabet's simplicity, flexibility, and portability ensured its survival and spread, making it one of the most influential legacies of the ancient Near East. From this innovation in writing, the story of the Canaanites moves naturally into their role as seafarers and traders across the Mediterranean, where the alphabet accompanied them on their journeys and became intertwined with their maritime culture and expansion into what would later be known as Phoenicia. The Mediterranean was as central to the Canaanites as the fertile valleys and bustling city-states inland. For a people living along a narrow coastal strip that looked westward to the sea and eastward to deserts and mountains, the waters of the Mediterranean offered both opportunity and danger. It was through seafaring that the Canaanites expanded their influence, carried their goods to distant lands, and established a legacy that would continue long after their own city-states had changed hands. The path to what we later call Phoenicia lies in the maritime culture of the Canaanites, whose skill in navigation, shipbuilding, and trade allowed them to extend their reach far beyond their own shores. The coast of Canaan provided a natural environment for maritime activity. Unlike the long, sandy stretches of Egypt's Mediterranean shoreline, the Canaanite coast was broken by a series of natural harbours, inlets, and promontories. Places like Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and Arwad offered sheltered anchorages where ships could dock safely, and where ports could grow into thriving centres of commerce. The cedar forests of the Lebanon mountains towering above the coast supplied wood of exceptional quality for shipbuilding. These factors combined to make the Canaanites natural seafarers, capable of constructing vessels that could withstand the demands of open sea travel, and of using their geography to advantage. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that Canaanite maritime trade was flourishing as early as the 3rd millennium BCE. Byblos, in particular, developed a strong relationship with Egypt during the Old Kingdom. Egyptian inscriptions describe the importation of cedar wood from Byblos, prized for building ships, temples, and monumental architecture. In return, Biblian rulers received Egyptian goods such as gold, alabaster, and papyrus, as well as political recognition in the form of royal gifts and honours. The bond between Byblos and Egypt became so strong that Egyptian motifs appeared in Biblian art, and hieroglyphic inscriptions were found within the city. Ships travelled back and forth across the eastern Mediterranean, laden with timber, wine, resins, and crafted goods, creating a maritime network that linked the Nile with the Levantine coast. The ships of the Canaanites were renowned for their strength and design. Reliefs from Egypt depict vessels with high curved prows and sterns, large square sails and multiple oars, capable of navigating both coastal waters and open seas. These ships were built with planks lashed together and reinforced with cedar, making them durable and flexible enough to withstand rough conditions. Archaeological finds of shipwrecks in the Mediterranean reveal cargoes that included Canaanite amphorae filled with wine and oil, as well as luxury items destined for foreign markets. The ships carried not only goods but also ideas, styles, and technologies, spreading Canaanite influence wherever they travelled. Seafaring was not merely a matter of trade, but also of cultural identity. The sea, symbolised in myth by the god Yam, was both feared and respected. While Yam was portrayed as a chaotic and threatening force, the ability of Canaanite sailors to master the waters demonstrated their skill and courage. Rituals and offerings likely accompanied voyages, seeking divine protection for ships and crews. Ports became not only economic hubs, but also centres of religious life, where temples stood near harbours and gods were invoked for safe passage. The maritime character of Canaanite cities distinguished them from inland centres like Hazor or Megiddo, tying their fortunes more closely to the waves than to the soil. The expansion of Canaanite seafaring set the stage for the emergence of Phoenicia in the early 1st millennium BCE. The term Phoenician is a Greek label derived from phoenix, meaning purple, a reference to the famous purple dye extracted from murex shells along the Levantine coast. But the people we call Phoenicians were the descendants of the Canaanites, inheritors of their cities, gods, language, and maritime traditions. The transformation from Canaanite to Phoenician was not abrupt but gradual, reflecting shifts in political power and external pressures rather than a fundamental change in culture. Byblos, Sidon and Tyre, already prominent in the late Bronze Age, continued to thrive, now taking advantage of opportunities that arose after the collapse of older powers such as the Hittites and Egyptians at the end of the Bronze Age. The Phoenicians became the heirs to the Canaanite maritime legacy, but the foundations of their success lay in the centuries of seafaring that had come before. The routes pioneered by Canaanite merchants extended across the Mediterranean, reaching Cyprus, Crete, and even Greece. Canaanite pottery and goods have been found in Aegean contexts, while Mycenaean ceramics appear in Canaanite ports, evidence of reciprocal exchange. These early contacts laid the groundwork for later Phoenician colonization and influence. The alphabet, developed in Canaan, travelled with these merchants, spreading gradually into new lands where it would be adapted into Greek and other scripts. The social and economic structures of seafaring communities shaped their distinctive identities. Merchant families gained wealth and prestige through maritime trade, their influence sometimes rivaling that of land-based elites. Ports became cosmopolitan centres, filled with foreign merchants, sailors and travellers. Markets in Byblos or Sidon would have offered goods from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia and beyond, making them crossroads of cultures. This cosmopolitanism gave coastal Canaanite cities a character distinct from inland towns, more open to foreign influence and more outward-looking in their ambitions. The religious life of these seafaring cities also reflected their maritime orientation. Temples dedicated to Baal of the sea or to local storm deities emphasised protection for sailors and success in trade. Inscriptions from Tyre and Sidon later invoke Melkart, a god associated with the sea and navigation, showing how older Canaanite traditions evolved in maritime contexts. Rituals before departure and upon safe return were likely part of the rhythm of life in these ports, binding economic activity to religious devotion. Canaanite seafaring also played a role in the transmission of technology and ideas. Shipbuilding techniques developed along the Levantine coast influenced neighbouring cultures, while Canaanite artisans carried skills in metallurgy, weaving and pottery across the sea. The spread of alphabetic writing owed much to these maritime connections, for sailors and merchants required simple systems of notation for cargo lists, contracts and correspondence. Through the sea, Canaanite innovations became Mediterranean innovations, embedded in the cultural exchanges of the Bronze and Iron Ages. Political developments further encouraged the maritime orientation of Canaanite cities. During periods of Egyptian dominance, coastal towns often served as intermediaries, collecting tribute and supplying goods to the pharaoh's administration. At other times, when Egypt weakened, these cities gained greater autonomy, turning their energy outward into the Mediterranean. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age, marked by invasions of the so-called Sea Peoples, and the decline of major empires, created both dangers and opportunities. While some Canaanite cities were destroyed or weakened, others adapted, re-emerging as the powerful Phoenician city-states of the Iron Age. This adaptability, rooted in centuries of maritime experience, ensured the survival and transformation of the Canaanite heritage. Everyday life in the seafaring cities combined local traditions with international influences. Fishermen and sailors shared space with merchants, artisans and priests. Markets sold both local produce and exotic imports, while harbour districts bustled with activity as ships unloaded cargoes and crews mingled with residents. Languages from across the Mediterranean could be heard in these streets, creating a polyglot environment that shaped the outlook of coastal Canaanites. Their openness to the wider world became one of their defining traits, distinguishing them from more insular inland communities. The Canaanite mastery of the sea laid the groundwork for one of the most remarkable aspects of their later Phoenician identity: colonization. From their coastal cities, the Phoenicians established settlements across the Mediterranean, from Cyprus to North Africa, from Sicily to Spain. Carthage, founded in the 9th century BCE, became one of the greatest cities of antiquity, rivaling Rome itself. Yet all of this expansion can be traced back to the maritime culture of the earlier Canaanites, who first turned their gaze westward and discovered that the sea was not merely a boundary, but a highway. The transformation from Canaanite seafarers to Phoenician navigators illustrates both continuity and change. The same skills in shipbuilding, navigation and trade that had sustained Canaanite ports in the Bronze Age became the basis for Phoenician power in the Iron Age. The same gods who protected sailors in Byblos and Sidon continued to receive offerings in Tyre and Carthage. The same alphabet developed in Canaan spread with Phoenician merchants, leaving its mark on the Mediterranean world. The sea was therefore not only an economic resource, but a defining element of identity. It shaped the architecture of cities, the organisation of trade, the rhythms of religion, and the imagination of myths. The Canaanites who braved its waters and built their lives upon its shores created a maritime tradition that outlasted their political independence, ensuring that their legacy endured in the name and power of Phoenicia. From this maritime world, the Canaanites also developed systems of defence and warfare that protected their cities from external threats and ensured the safety of their trade, leading naturally into the story of their military practices and the fortifications that defined their urban landscapes. Conflict was an ever-present reality in the land of Canaan. The same geography that made the region fertile and strategically valuable also made it vulnerable to invasion and competition. Its city-states, nestled along trade routes and in fertile valleys, were rarely free from the shadow of war. Armies marched across Canaan from Egypt, Mesopotamia and Anatolia, while rival cities and tribal groups fought one another for control of land, trade and influence. Warfare was not an occasional disruption but a recurring feature of life, shaping the architecture of cities, the organisation of society, and the very identity of the Canaanites. Their fortifications, weapons and military strategies reveal a people constantly preparing for threats, adapting to changing technologies, and seeking to secure their place in a turbulent world. The city-state system itself fostered competition. Unlike large unified empires, Canaan was divided into dozens of independent polities, each centred on a fortified town and the surrounding countryside. These polities were often ruled by local kings or chiefs, whose authority rested on their ability to protect their people, manage trade and assert dominance over rivals. With no single power uniting the region, alliances shifted frequently, and conflict was common. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE, provide vivid testimony of this fragmented landscape. In these tablets, Canaanite rulers write to the Egyptian pharaoh, pleading for aid against enemies, accusing one another of treachery or boasting of loyalty. The letters reveal a political world in which rivalries and wars were constant, and the survival of a city depended on both diplomacy and defence. Fortifications were the most visible response to this environment. excavations at sites such as Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish and Jericho have revealed massive walls built of mud brick on stone foundations, sometimes reinforced with towers and gates. These walls could be several meters thick and high, enclosing the city in a protective barrier. In some cases, ramparts of packed earth sloped upward toward the walls, making it more difficult for attackers to scale them. Gates were particularly elaborate, often flanked by towers and chambers that controlled access and allowed defenders to concentrate their forces. These fortifications required immense labour and resources, reflecting both the wealth of the city and the central importance of defence in urban life. The design of Canaanite fortifications shows awareness of both local threats and the possibility of large-scale invasions. The ramparts at Hazor and Megiddo, for example, demonstrate a sophistication in engineering that suggests experience in dealing with siege warfare. Attackers had to contend not only with walls, but also with sloping glacis that forced them to fight uphill. Defenders could rain missiles down on approaching enemies, using bows, slings and spears from the safety of their walls. In addition to defensive architecture, underground water systems were developed in some cities, ensuring that a besieged population could access fresh water without leaving the walls. This innovation speaks to the reality of prolonged sieges, when enemies surrounded a city for months at a time, attempting to starve it into submission. Weapons used by the Canaanites reflected both local traditions and international influences. Bronze was the primary material for weapons during much of the Bronze Age, with swords, daggers, spearheads, and arrowheads commonly produced. Chariots, introduced from the north and east, became an important feature of Canaanite warfare by the 2nd millennium BCE. These light, two-wheeled vehicles, drawn by horses, offered mobility and striking power, particularly on open plains. In battle, chariots could break enemy formations, chase fleeing troops, and serve as platforms for archers. The possession of chariots was often limited to elites, making them both a weapon and a symbol of status. Reliefs and texts from Egypt describe encounters with Canaanite chariots, showing that they were a recognized feature of the region's military landscape. Archery was another crucial element of Canaanite warfare. Composite bows made of wood, horn and sinew provided superior range and power compared to simple wooden bows. These bows, expensive and difficult to produce, were highly prized and often associated with elite warriors. Slingers also played a role, using stones or clay pellets to harass enemies from a distance. In close combat, spearmen and swordsmen formed the bulk of infantry forces, fighting in relatively small numbers compared to the massed armies of larger empires. Warfare in Canaan was often characterized by raids, skirmishes, and sieges rather than large pitched battles, reflecting the scale of its city-states and the ruggedness of its terrain. The role of mercenaries and semi-nomadic groups added further complexity to the military world of Canaan. Texts mention groups such as the Habiru, bands of warriors or outlaws who offered their services to rulers or disrupted settled life through raids. These groups could be both allies and enemies depending on circumstance. City rulers sometimes hired them to bolster their forces, while at other times they threatened the stability of the region. The presence of such groups highlights the fluidity of Canaanite warfare, where loyalty was often temporary and survival required constant adaptation. Religion and warfare were closely linked. Victories were attributed to the favour of the gods, while defeats were seen as signs of divine displeasure. Temples received spoils of war, including captured goods and sometimes prisoners, offered as sacrifices. Gods such as Baal and Anat were invoked as warrior deities, protectors in battle and guarantors of victory. Anat, in particular, was portrayed in myth as a ferocious goddess of war, slaughtering enemies without mercy. This divine ferocity reflected the realities of Canaanite warfare, where survival demanded ruthlessness. Kings and rulers often emphasized their devotion to the gods in military contexts, reinforcing their legitimacy as leaders chosen and supported by divine powers. The impact of warfare extended beyond the battlefield. For common people, war meant insecurity, destruction of crops, loss of homes, and disruption of trade. Archaeological evidence shows layers of destruction in many Canaanite cities, burned walls, collapsed structures, and mass graves. These layers testify to the repeated cycles of conflict that reshaped the region. Yet after each destruction, cities were often rebuilt, sometimes stronger than before, demonstrating the resilience of Canaanite society. Warfare was devastating but not terminal. It was an accepted part of the rhythm of life, and communities adapted to it with fortifications, alliances, and religious rituals aimed at securing protection. The military world of Canaan was also shaped by its relationship with larger empires. Egyptian campaigns into the region are well documented, with pharaohs boasting of victories over rebellious Canaanite rulers or foreign invaders passing through the land. Reliefs from Karnak and inscriptions in Egyptian temples describe the subjugation of Canaanite towns, the capture of prisoners, and the taking of tribute. For the Canaanites, these invasions meant not only direct conflict, but also the constant balancing act of diplomacy, tribute, and rebellion. To resist Egypt outright was dangerous, but to submit too fully risked losing autonomy. Warfare was thus as much political as it was physical, a negotiation of survival in the shadow of greater powers. Later, the incursions of the Sea Peoples at the end of the Bronze Age further transformed the military world of Canaan. These groups, arriving by land and sea, attacked cities, disrupted trade, and contributed to the collapse of established powers. Some Canaanite cities were destroyed, while others adapted, integrating elements of the newcomers into their populations. The upheaval of this period reshaped the political and military landscape, paving the way for the emergence of new powers in the Iron Age. The resilience of coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon, however, demonstrates that maritime defence and adaptability allowed some Canaanite centres to survive and even thrive in the aftermath. The social role of warriors in Canaanite society was significant. Elite warriors, especially chariot owners and archers, enjoyed high status, often reflected in their burials, which included weapons, armour, and ornaments. Common soldiers, though less celebrated, were essential to the defence of their cities. Conscription of farmers and labourers during times of war meant that much of the population was directly involved in military activity at some point. The demands of defence and the reality of conflict permeated daily life, influencing not only architecture and economy, but also social values, where bravery, loyalty, and skill in combat were highly esteemed. The military practices of the Canaanites, their fortifications and their strategies were not isolated developments, but part of the broader cultural patterns of the ancient Near East. They borrowed technologies, adapted to innovations, and contributed their own practices to the wider world. Their emphasis on fortified cities, their use of chariots, and their reliance on both diplomacy and force illustrate a pragmatic approach to survival in a contested landscape. The world of warfare and fortification in Canaan shaped not only the destiny of its people, but also their interactions with neighbours and empires. It influenced their political structures, their religious practices, and their cultural identity. From this militarized environment, the story of the Canaanites flows naturally into the wider web of relations with surrounding powers, where diplomacy, trade, and conflict intersected in the constant negotiation of survival and influence. The land of Canaan never existed in isolation. Its cities, villages, and trade routes were woven into a dense fabric of interactions with the great civilizations that surrounded it. Egypt to the south, Mesopotamia to the east, and Anatolia to the north all cast their influence over the Levant, sometimes as trading partners, sometimes as overlords, and often as rivals. The Canaanites lived in the crossroads of these powers, and their history cannot be understood apart from these relationships. For the Canaanite people, survival and prosperity required constant negotiation between submission and resistance, trade and tribute, adaptation and preservation of identity. Their place in the wider world was never static, but always shifting with the balance of power in the ancient Near East. Egypt exerted perhaps the most consistent influence over Canaan throughout much of the second millennium BCE. The proximity of the Nile Valley meant that Egyptian rulers regarded Canaan as both a buffer zone and a vital resource. Its trade goods, timber, wine, oil, resins, and precious metals were highly prized in Egypt, while its position along the land routes leading to Mesopotamia made it strategically indispensable. Egyptian military campaigns into Canaan are recorded as early as the reign of Pharaoh Sneferu in the Old Kingdom, when expeditions brought cedar wood from Byblos. By the Middle Kingdom, Egyptian presence was felt more directly, with fortresses and garrisons established in southern Canaan to secure trade routes and resources. The New Kingdom brought Egyptian dominance to its height. Pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Ramses II boasted of campaigns in Canaan, subduing rebellious city-states and extracting tribute. The Battle of Megiddo in the 15th century BCE, led by Thutmose III, is one of the earliest recorded battles in history, and it demonstrates the scale of Egyptian military power in the region. Egyptian inscriptions describe long lists of captured towns, prisoners, and spoils, underscoring the importance placed on controlling Canaanite territory. Temples in Egypt were adorned with reliefs showing bound Canaanite captives, their foreign hairstyles and clothing serving as markers of their identity. Despite this military subjugation, the relationship between Egypt and Canaan was not purely one of domination. Trade and cultural exchange flourished under Egyptian hegemony. Egyptian artifacts, including scarabs, amulets and pottery, have been found in Canaanite sites, while Canaanite goods flowed southward to Egyptian markets. Some Canaanite rulers adopted Egyptian styles of art and writing, using hieroglyphs in inscriptions or incorporating Egyptian motifs into local objects. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in the Amarna letters of the 14th century BCE reveals the complexity of this relationship. In these tablets, Canaanite kings address the pharaoh as their overlord, offering loyalty while simultaneously pleading for assistance against rivals or complaining of neighbours. The tone alternates between deference and manipulation, showing the precarious position of rulers caught between serving Egypt and pursuing their own ambitions. Mesopotamia's influence was equally significant, though more intermittent. The cultural prestige of Mesopotamia, with its ancient cities and writing systems, was immense, and Canaanites absorbed many elements of Mesopotamian tradition. Akkadian, the language of diplomacy across the Near East, was used by Canaanite scribes, as the Amarna letters again reveal. Cuneiform tablets discovered in Hazor and Ugarit demonstrate that Canaanite elites were trained in Mesopotamian writing, adopting its forms for administrative and literary purposes. The myths of Mesopotamia also resonated in Canaan, with themes such as the battle between storm gods and forces of chaos echoing in the Baal cycle. The influence was not one-sided, however. Canaanite innovations, especially in writing, also made their way eastward, showing the reciprocal nature of cultural exchange. Politically, Mesopotamian empires occasionally extended their reach into Canaan. During the 3rd millennium BCE, rulers of Akkad, such as Sargon and Naram-Sin, claimed campaigns to the Upper Sea, a term often interpreted as the Mediterranean. While the extent of direct control is debated, such campaigns suggest awareness of and occasional incursions into the Levant. Later, the Amorite dynasties, including Hammurabi of Babylon, had indirect influence over the region through networks of trade and diplomacy. In the Late Bronze Age, the Mitanni kingdom, based in northern Mesopotamia, also vied for influence over northern Canaan, competing with both Egypt and the Hittites. Anatolia, dominated by the Hittite Empire in the 2nd millennium BCE, added yet another dimension to Canaan's geopolitical reality. The Hittites, expanding southward from their heartland in central Anatolia, clashed with Egypt for control of Syria and northern Canaan. The famous Battle of Kadesh, around 1274 BCE, fought between Ramses II and the Hittite king Muwatallis II, took place on the fringes of this contested zone. Though the battle ended in a stalemate, it highlights the strategic importance of Canaan and Syria as the frontier between great powers. For the Canaanites, these struggles between empires meant constant vulnerability. A city might be allied with Egypt one year, threatened by Hittites the next, and pressured by local rivals all the while. Survival required careful diplomacy and, often, submission to whichever power seemed strongest at the moment. The Hittite influence on Canaanite culture was less pervasive than that of Egypt or Mesopotamia, but traces remain. Artifacts bearing Hittite styles, treaties written in Hittite diplomatic fashion, and cultural borrowings such as certain deities introduced into local pantheons suggest contact and exchange. In Ugarit especially, the presence of Hittite scribal practices and administrative structures reveals the city's role as a vassal within the Hittite imperial system. Yet even under foreign dominance, Canaanite cities retained significant autonomy in managing their own affairs, reflecting the flexibility of the city-state system. These overlapping spheres of influence created a world in which the Canaanites were both subordinate and indispensable. Subordinate because their small polities lacked the power to resist great empires for long, but indispensable because their land and cities lay at the nexus of trade and communication. Egyptian pharaohs, Mesopotamian kings, and Hittite rulers all recognized that control of Canaan meant control of the land bridge connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. Canaan was thus both prize and pawn in the great game of ancient geopolitics. The impact of these relationships on Canaanite society was profound. Economically, the demand for goods by empires stimulated production and trade, enriching Canaanite elites who acted as intermediaries. Culturally, exposure to multiple civilizations fostered a cosmopolitan identity, with Canaanite cities absorbing and blending influences from all sides. Religiously, foreign gods and practices sometimes entered the local pantheon, while Canaanite deities found echoes in neighbouring traditions. Politically, the constant pressure from outside powers forced rulers to refine their diplomatic skills, balancing loyalty and rebellion, tribute and independence. For ordinary people, these international dynamics could mean both prosperity and suffering. Trade brought wealth, foreign luxuries, and new ideas, but war brought destruction, displacement, and oppression. Archaeological evidence of destruction layers in cities such as Hazor and Megiddo testifies to the violence of imperial campaigns, while finds of imported goods in ordinary houses show the benefits of cross-cultural exchange. Life in Canaan was thus lived in the tension between opportunity and vulnerability, shaped by forces both near and far. The Canaanites' position among their neighbours illustrates the paradox of being at the centre of the ancient world. Their cities were never the largest, their armies never the strongest, and their empires never the most enduring. Yet their land was the passageway through which the ambitions of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia collided, and it was this very position that ensured their influence. Even as they bent under the weight of greater powers, they absorbed, adapted, and transmitted elements of those cultures, preserving their own identity while shaping the larger patterns of the ancient Near East. From these constant interactions, the story of the Canaanites moves further into the diplomatic world of the Late Bronze Age, where correspondence and negotiations reveal their place within the international system of pharaohs, kings, and great rulers, a stage most vividly preserved in the archives of Amarna. The Late Bronze Age brought with it a level of international contact and diplomacy across the Near East that was unprecedented in earlier centuries, and nowhere is this more vividly illustrated than in the archives discovered at Amarna in Egypt. In the 14th century BCE, during the reigns of Pharaoh Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, scribes in the city of Akhetaten, the pharaoh's new capital, preserved hundreds of clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform. These tablets, known today as the Amarna letters, provide an extraordinary window into the world of Canaan during this period. They reveal the voices of its rulers, the struggles of its city-states, and the intricate web of relationships that tied Canaan to Egypt and to the wider international system of the Late Bronze Age. The Amarna letters are diplomatic correspondence, but they are far from dry or formulaic. They are filled with urgency, emotion, pleading, and accusation. Written by kings, princes, and governors of Canaanite cities to the Egyptian pharaoh, they shed light on the precarious position of local rulers who lived under Egyptian hegemony, but faced constant threats from rivals and raiders. Each letter begins with elaborate expressions of loyalty, affirming the pharaoh's supremacy. Writers often refer to themselves as the pharaoh's servants, or even as his dust, bowing 7 times and 7 times again at the feet of the king. These formulaic phrases emphasize Egypt's dominance, yet the contents of the letters quickly reveal the anxieties and ambitions of the Canaanite rulers. Canaan at this time was not a unified kingdom, but a mosaic of small city-states, each ruled by a local king or governor. The letters show how these rulers manoeuvred within the shadow of Egypt, appealing to the pharaoh for help against their neighbours, while also accusing one another of disloyalty. One ruler might complain that another had seized his lands, while yet another begged for military aid against the Habiru, groups of semi-nomadic raiders whose presence destabilized the countryside. The Habiru appear repeatedly in the correspondence, described as a persistent threat that burned villages, captured people, and disrupted trade. Whether these groups were outlaws, displaced peoples, or mercenaries, they represent the volatility of Canaan in this era, a land where settled and unsettled life constantly collided. The letters also reveal the limits of Egyptian control. Though the pharaoh was addressed as overlord, his ability to intervene directly was often constrained. Canaanite rulers frequently begged for military garrisons or supplies of archers, but these requests were not always granted. Egypt maintained strategic centres such as Gaza and Beth Shean as bases for troops, yet its grip on more distant towns was tenuous. This gave local rulers room to manoeuvre, but it also left them vulnerable. They had to maintain loyalty to Egypt while fending off rivals and trying to expand their own authority. The result was a landscape of constant tension, where diplomacy, bribery, and treachery played as much a role as open warfare. One of the most famous correspondents in the Amarna archive was Abdi Heba, the ruler of Jerusalem. His letters depict a man besieged by enemies, claiming that without Egyptian help he could not hold the city. He accused neighbouring rulers of treachery, denounced the Habiru as a dire threat, and portrayed himself as a loyal servant of the pharaoh. Yet scholars have noted that Abdi Heba, like others, likely exaggerated his plight in order to secure Egyptian support. His appeals illustrate how Canaanite rulers used the language of desperation to manipulate their relationship with Egypt, presenting themselves as indispensable allies while casting rivals as rebels. Other letters provide insight into the political rivalries that defined the region. Ribhada, the ruler of Byblos, was one of the most prolific correspondents, writing dozens of letters filled with complaints about neighbouring kings and his desperate need for Egyptian assistance. He portrays himself as a loyal vassal, abandoned by his overlord, while his enemies gain power and threaten his city. His increasingly frantic tone shows the precarious nature of Canaanite politics, where alliances shifted quickly and the survival of a city could hinge on external support. In the end, Ribhada was overthrown, illustrating the brutal reality that no amount of letters could guarantee protection if local rivals gained the upper hand. The Amarna letters also highlight the role of gifts and tribute in diplomacy. Canaanite rulers regularly sent shipments of goods to Egypt, timber, horses, and luxury items as tokens of loyalty. In return, they expected gifts of gold, supplies, or military assistance. These exchanges were not merely economic but symbolic, affirming the bond between vassal and overlord. Yet complaints about inadequate gifts are frequent, suggesting that the system was fraught with tension. The delicate balance between tribute and reward was a constant source of negotiation, and when expectations were not met, loyalty was strained. Culturally, the letters show how deeply integrated Canaan was into the international world of the Late Bronze Age. They were written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Near East, though often with Canaanite linguistic features, creating a hybrid dialect known as Canaanite Akkadian. This mixture reflects the cosmopolitan character of the region, where local scribes adapted international forms to their own context. The presence of trained scribes in Canaanite courts demonstrates the sophistication of these small states, which, despite their political vulnerability, participated fully in the diplomatic practices of the time. The Amarna archive also includes correspondence between Egypt and the great powers of the day, Babylon, Mitanni, the Hittites, showing that Canaanite rulers operated within a larger system of international relations. The so-called Great Kings exchanged daughters in marriage, gold and silver, and diplomatic courtesies, while Canaanite rulers, by contrast, were minor players who constantly had to reaffirm their loyalty. Their position was humbler, yet their land was no less significant, for it formed the connective tissue linking the great empires. This made them indispensable even as they were subordinated. The world revealed in these letters is one of instability, anxiety, and constant manoeuvring. Canaanite rulers lived under the gaze of Egypt, but struggled with enemies on all sides. Their correspondence is filled with pleas for archers, for troops, for recognition, and for justice, often couched in exaggerated terms designed to provoke a response. At the same time, the letters reflect the resilience of these rulers, who used every tool at their disposal to preserve their cities. Diplomacy, rhetoric, and appeals to divine and royal favour were as important as walls and weapons in the struggle for survival. For historians, the Amarna letters are invaluable because they give voice to the Canaanites themselves, something rare in the ancient record. Unlike later biblical traditions, which often depict the Canaanites from an outside perspective, these tablets preserve their own words, their own fears and ambitions. They show the texture of life in a land caught between empires, where loyalty was fragile and survival precarious. They also demonstrate how Canaanite rulers viewed Egypt, not only as overlord but as arbiter, protector, and sometimes a distant and unreliable ally. The Amarna period did not last long. The religious upheavals of Akhenaten's reign, with his focus on the sun god Aten, distracted Egypt from its foreign affairs, weakening its hold on Canaan. This neglect allowed rival powers and local rebels to gain ground, contributing to the instability reflected in the letters. By the end of the 14th century BCE, Egypt's dominance in the Levant had begun to wane, opening the way for new challenges and transformations in the region. Yet the record of this time remains preserved in the tablets buried in the sands of Amarna, providing a unique snapshot of Canaanite life under imperial shadow. The voices of Rib-Hadda, Abdi-Heba, and others resonate across millennia, not as conquerors or kings of great empires, but as rulers of vulnerable cities, pleading, bargaining, and scheming in the hope of preserving their fragile power. Their words remind us that history is not only the story of great empires, but also of those who lived between them, struggling to endure. From this age of correspondence and fragile alliances, the story of Canaan flows into the encounters with emerging groups within the region itself, most famously the Israelites, whose interactions with the Canaanites would shape both history and memory for centuries to come. The relationship between the Israelites and the Canaanites has long been one of the most discussed and contested subjects in the history of the ancient Near East. It is a relationship marked by conflict, but also by deep cultural overlap, shared traditions, and gradual blending. For centuries, the narrative was told primarily through the lens of biblical texts, where the Canaanites are often cast as the adversaries of the Israelites, depicted as idolaters whose practices stood in opposition to the covenantal faith of Israel. Yet archaeology and historical analysis reveal a more complex picture, one in which the Israelites did not emerge as a completely distinct and isolated people, but rather out of the same cultural and geographical environment that had sustained the Canaanites for generations. What appears in literature as sharp division was in reality a gradual process of differentiation, negotiation, and continuity. The origins of the Israelites are intertwined with the Canaanite world. Archaeological evidence from the central highlands of Canaan in the late 2nd millennium BCE reveals the emergence of new settlements, small villages and agricultural communities that lack the monumental architecture of the lowland city-states, but displayed continuity in pottery, tools and material culture with earlier Canaanite traditions. These highland settlers, often identified with early Israelites, lived in simple four-room houses, tended fields of grain, kept flocks, and used pottery styles indistinguishable from their Canaanite neighbours. There is no evidence of sudden invasion or cultural rupture. Rather, the data suggest a local development, a process in which groups already living within the land gradually coalesced into a new identity. Biblical accounts, particularly in the books of Joshua and Judges, present a picture of conquest, with Israelite tribes sweeping into Canaan under divine command, defeating city after city and displacing their inhabitants. Jericho, Ai, and Hazor are all described as destroyed by Israelite forces. Yet the archaeological record complicates this narrative. Jericho, for example, shows destruction centuries earlier than the supposed time of conquest, while Ai was largely abandoned during that period. Hazor does show evidence of violent destruction around the 13th century BCE, but whether this was the work of Israelites or another force remains debated. What emerges is not a simple story of invasion, but one of gradual transformation, where some cities fell, others declined, and new rural communities emerged in the highlands, laying the foundation for Israelite identity. Cultural and religious practices illustrate the continuity between Canaanites and Israelites. The language spoken by both was essentially the same. Hebrew is a northwest Semitic tongue closely related to Canaanite dialects, and many words, idioms, and grammatical structures overlap. Names of individuals preserved in inscriptions and texts show similar patterns, with theophoric elements invoking deities such as El. The high god of the Canaanite pantheon, El appears in early Israelite religion as the god of the patriarchs, the one called El Shaddai, or El Elyon. Even Yahweh, the distinctive God of Israel, seems at times to have been associated with El, gradually absorbing attributes until he became identified as the supreme and only God of Israelite worship. The worship of Asherah, too, may have lingered among early Israelites. Archaeological finds, such as inscriptions from Kuntelet Ajrud in the Sinai, dating to the 8th century BCE, include blessings given by Yahweh and his Asherah. Figurines representing a female deity with emphasized breasts, similar to those associated with Asherah in Canaanite contexts, have been found in Israelite sites as well. These discoveries suggest that for centuries the lines between Canaanite and Israelite religion were blurred, and only over time did Israelite religion distinguish itself through reforms and exclusivist theology. Prophetic denunciations of Baal worship, child sacrifice, and fertility cults preserved in the Hebrew Bible can be read as evidence of just how pervasive these practices were within Israelite society. They were not simply foreign practices of neighbours, but rival traditions within their own communities. Agricultural life also bound the two peoples together. Israelites and Canaanites cultivated the same crops: wheat, barley, olives, and grapes, depended on rainfall, and participated in similar seasonal cycles. Festivals tied to planting and harvest, such as those later absorbed into the Israelite calendar as Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, bear striking resemblance to earlier Canaanite agricultural rites. The rhythm of the land, the reliance on rains that came or failed, and the need for fertility shaped the rituals of both peoples. What distinguished Israelite practice in time was the reframing of these festivals as commemorations of covenantal history: Exodus from Egypt, receiving the law at Sinai, dwelling in the wilderness, rather than as celebrations of Baal's rains or Asherah's fertility. The continuity is clear, even as the interpretation changed. Conflict between Israelites and Canaanites, however, was real, even if not in the sweeping terms of biblical conquest narratives. In the lowland plains and fortified cities, Canaanite rulers continued to control territory even as new Israelite communities appeared in the highlands. Judges and other texts describe cycles of warfare, alliances, and struggles for dominance. At times, Israelites are portrayed as subjugated by Canaanite kings, such as Jabin of Hazor and his general Sisera, against whom Deborah and Barak led a revolt. These accounts, while embellished, reflect the real tensions between established city-states and rising tribal coalitions. Archaeology supports the picture of a patchwork landscape, with Canaanite cities, Philistine enclaves, and Israelite villages coexisting in proximity, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. Over time, as Israelite identity solidified, the distinction from Canaanite traditions became more pronounced. The centralization of worship in Jerusalem under kings such as Ezekiel and Josiah emphasized exclusive devotion to Yahweh, rejecting the worship of Baal, Asherah, and other deities. Biblical writers cast the Canaanites as archetypes of idolatry, associating them with forbidden practices and moral corruption. Yet this polemic itself demonstrates how deeply embedded Canaanite traditions had been, for such warnings would not have been necessary had the influences not been widespread. The struggle to define Israelite identity was in large part a struggle to distance themselves from the cultural matrix out of which they had arisen. The fusion of traditions is also evident in material culture. Pottery styles, architectural forms, and domestic arrangements in early Israelite settlements show continuity with Canaanite models. The famous four-room house, often associated with Israelite architecture, has parallels in earlier Canaanite contexts, suggesting adaptation rather than invention. Burial practices likewise reveal overlap, with both groups burying their dead in family tombs, often accompanied by goods. Only gradually did distinctive Israelite practices emerge, shaped by religious reforms and evolving cultural boundaries. From a broader perspective, the relationship between Israelites and Canaanites illustrates the complexity of cultural change in the ancient world. Peoples did not appear fully formed or wholly distinct. They evolved within shared environments, borrowing, resisting, and redefining. The Israelites emerged not as outsiders sweeping into the land, but as part of the land's own people, inheritors of its traditions and shapers of new ones. The conflicts recorded in biblical texts reflect the process of differentiation, while the continuities preserved in language, religion, and daily life reveal the shared heritage that bound them together. In later centuries, as Israelite tradition became codified in scripture, the memory of Canaanites was shaped into a moral and theological foil. They became the other against whom Israelite identity was defined, their practices condemned, their fate presented as a warning. Yet beneath this polemical surface lies the historical reality of fusion and continuity. The Israelites were, in many respects, children of Canaan, even as they redefined themselves as distinct from their forebears. The interaction between Israelites and Canaanites was not only a matter of cultural fusion and religious divergence, but also part of the broader story of resistance and survival in the shadow of larger empires, where the small polities of the Levant constantly adjusted to the dominance of powers such as Assyria and Babylon, continuing the pattern of adaptation that had defined Canaanite life for centuries. Death was never seen by the Canaanites as a final rupture, but rather as a continuation of existence in another realm, one that demanded attention, ritual, and connection. The ways in which the Canaanites buried their dead, remembered their ancestors, and conceived of the underworld reveal not only their view of mortality, but also the structures of their society, their families, and their religious imagination. The practices surrounding death mirrored their beliefs about life, fertility, continuity, and the unseen world. Archaeology and textual evidence allow us to glimpse this dimension of their culture. where the grave was not an end but a threshold, and where the bonds between the living and the dead remained active and powerful. Canaanite burials varied by region, period, and social class, but certain patterns recur. One of the most common practices was interment in family tombs, often hewn into rock or constructed as chambered spaces. These tombs were reused over generations, with bodies placed alongside those of earlier relatives. This practice reflects the importance of kinship and continuity, binding the living community to the memory of ancestors. Burial in family tombs symbolized not only belonging to a household in life, but also remaining within that household after death. Grave goods accompanied the dead, ranging from pottery, food and jewellery to weapons and tools. These objects were not arbitrary. They were offerings meant to provide for the deceased in the afterlife, ensuring sustenance, status and protection in the unseen world. Archaeological excavations at sites like Megiddo, Lachish and Ugarit have uncovered tombs filled with such goods. Pottery vessels placed near bodies often contained food and drink, perhaps intended as provisions for the journey into the underworld. Jewellery and personal ornaments symbolise the continuity of identity and status beyond death, while weapons may have offered protection. The presence of imported goods such as Cypriot pottery or Egyptian scarabs in some tombs reveals the wealth and cosmopolitan connections of the deceased, as well as the belief that such objects carried symbolic or protective value. Even modest burials reflect care and ritual, suggesting that concern for the dead extended across social classes. The act of burial itself was accompanied by ritual. Evidence suggests that families gathered to mourn, offering prayers, sacrifices and libations to honour the deceased. Animal bones found in burial contexts indicate that sacrifices were sometimes made at the time of interment. Libation tubes, small conduits leading into the tomb from the surface, have been discovered at some sites, suggesting that offerings of drink were poured into the grave long after burial, maintaining an ongoing connection between the living and the dead. These practices point to a belief in the continued presence of ancestors, who required nourishment and remembrance to remain benevolent toward their descendants. Ancestor worship was a central component of Canaanite religious life. The dead were not simply gone, they lingered as part of the household and community. Inscriptions and texts from Ugarit refer to the Arpum, a group of ancestral spirits who could be invoked in rituals. These figures were seen as intermediaries between the living and the divine, protectors of families and guarantors of fertility and continuity. Ritual meals, offerings and commemorations maintained their favour. In this sense, the family tomb was not just a resting place for the dead, but a sacred space where the living and the ancestors met. The authority of elders and rulers may have been reinforced by this connection, as lineage and ancestry were sources of legitimacy both in life and in memory. The myths of Canaanite religion also reflected beliefs about death and the underworld. The Baal cycle, preserved in Ugaritic texts, describes Baal's descent into the realm of Mot, the god of death and sterility. In this myth, Baal is temporarily overcome by Mot, leading to drought and desolation in the land, until he is restored to life through the intervention of Anat. This story encapsulates the Canaanite understanding of death as a cycle, rather than a finality, a temporary domination by sterility that is followed by renewal. The myth also portrays the underworld as a powerful but not absolute realm, one that could be negotiated through divine struggle. For human beings, this myth resonated with the agricultural cycle, where death and life, barrenness and fertility, followed one another endlessly. Mot, as the personification of death, was a feared but inevitable figure. His domain was the dark underworld, a place of dust and silence, yet not entirely devoid of presence. The dead resided there, requiring offerings and remembrance. The relationship between the living and Mot was one of appeasement. Rituals ensured that his power did not overwhelm the fertility of the land or the continuity of life. In myth, his struggle with Baal represented the cosmic balance, while in ritual, libations and sacrifices acknowledged his presence and sought to maintain harmony. The underworld itself was conceived as a mirror of the earthly realm, a place where the dead lived on in a shadowy existence. Grave goods suggest that the deceased were thought to continue many of their earthly roles, eating, drinking, wearing ornaments, and wielding tools. This continuity reflects the Canaanite view that life extended beyond death, though in a diminished and dependent form. The dead required the support of the living, who maintained them through offerings. Neglect of ancestors was dangerous, for it risked turning them into restless or malevolent spirits. Care for the dead was therefore both an act of piety and a safeguard for the community. Funerary rituals also reinforced social bonds among the living. The gathering of family and community at burials, the shared meals, and the collective mourning reaffirmed kinship ties and social structures. Death, while a rupture, was also a moment of unity, when the living reaffirm their connections to one another and to their ancestors. The tomb was a physical reminder of lineage, anchoring identity in place and memory. In this way, burial practices were not only about the dead, but also about sustaining the living community through continuity with the past. The role of death in Canaanite religion is further illuminated by parallels with other Near Eastern cultures. Mesopotamian traditions also emphasized the need for offerings to the dead, while Egyptian beliefs elaborated the journey into the afterlife. The Canaanites, situated between these cultures, developed their own synthesis, emphasizing both the ongoing presence of ancestors and the cyclical nature of life and death reflected in their myths. Their rituals of libation, their family tombs, and their myths of Baal and Mot reveal a worldview where death was integrated into the rhythms of existence rather than standing apart from it. Archaeology has revealed striking variations in Canaanite burials, showing that social status played a role in funerary practices. Elite tombs contained elaborate goods, gold ornaments, imported vessels, and weapons, while common graves were simpler, with only modest pottery or personal items. This distinction reflects the broader stratification of society, where wealth and status persisted beyond death. Yet even the simplest burials display care, suggesting that every life was valued and remembered within its community. The universality of burial rituals underscores the shared belief in the continued existence of the dead and the necessity of maintaining their favour. The presence of child burials in jars or beneath household floors adds another dimension to Canaanite beliefs. Such practices, though sometimes interpreted as practical responses to high infant mortality, also reveal the integration of the dead into domestic space. The placement of infants within homes may have symbolized their continued presence within the family, binding the household to its deceased members in the most intimate of ways. This practice underscores the closeness of life and death in Canaanite thought, where the boundary between the living and the dead was porous. The connection between death and fertility is also evident in Canaanite ritual. Just as Baal's death in myth led to drought, so too human death was understood as part of the cycle of renewal. Offerings to the dead, libations poured into the earth, and rituals of remembrance all reinforced the idea that fertility and continuity depended on maintaining balance with the underworld. The ancestors, dwelling in Mot's realm, were both a source of danger and of blessing. Properly honoured, they ensured prosperity. Neglected, they could bring misfortune. Through these rituals, the Canaanites expressed a profound understanding of the interconnectedness of life and death, fertility and sterility, memory and identity. Their burials and ancestor worship created a tangible link between generations, while their myths provided a cosmic framework for understanding mortality. Death was not an isolated event, but part of a continuum, one that bound individuals to family, community, and the divine. From this world of graves, libations, and ancestral memory, the story of the Canaanites continues into the realm of their literature and myth, where their beliefs were preserved not only in ritual acts but also in epic poems and sacred texts, such as those discovered in the city of Ugarit, which reveal the richness of their imagination and the endurance of their cultural legacy. On the northern edge of the Canaanite world, along the coast of modern Syria, lay the city of Ugarit, a place that has given us one of the richest windows into the cultural and religious imagination of the Canaanites. Excavated in the 20th century at the site of Ras Shamra, Ugarit revealed archives of clay tablets inscribed with a unique alphabetic cuneiform script, texts that preserved myths, epics, hymns, prayers, and ritual instructions. These discoveries transformed our understanding of Canaanite religion and literature, for they provided direct voices from the culture itself, rather than later interpretations or hostile accounts. Through these texts, the myths of Baal, El, Asherah, Anat and other deities come alive, allowing us to see the theological structures, poetic forms, and narrative traditions of the Canaanite world. Ugarit flourished in the 2nd millennium BCE, a city-state connected by trade to Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Cyprus. Its prosperity was reflected not only in its material culture but in its intellectual life. Scribes at Ugarit developed a 30-letter alphabetic cuneiform, distinct from the linear alphabets of southern Canaan, but based on the same principle of representing consonantal sounds with a limited set of symbols. This innovation made the recording of literature more accessible and efficient, and it ensured that the myths and rituals of Ugarit would be preserved in remarkable detail. The archives discovered there include hundreds of tablets, many of them broken but still decipherable, offering a comprehensive picture of Canaanite thought. Among the most significant texts are those known as the Baal cycle, a series of epic narratives that recount the struggles of Baal, the storm god, against his rivals Yam, the sea god, and Mot, the god of death. These stories are not mere tales but theological reflections on the cycles of nature, the balance of fertility and drought, life and death. In the first part of the cycle, Baal battles Yam, whose chaotic waters threaten the order of the cosmos. With weapons forged by Kothar Wakasis, the divine craftsman, Baal defeats Yam and establishes his kingship among the gods. Yet his rule is not secure, for he must contend with Mot, whose embrace signifies sterility and death. Baal is swallowed by Mot, bringing desolation to the land, until Anat, his sister and fierce ally, defeats Mot and restores Baal to life. This cycle, reflecting the seasonal rhythms of the Levant, dramatizes the eternal struggle between fertility and barrenness, life and death. For the Canaanites, it explained the agricultural cycle and provided a framework for rituals that sought to ensure the return of rains and the abundance of harvests. The Baal cycle also illuminates the structure of the Canaanite pantheon. El, the high god, appears as the patriarchal authority who presides over the assembly of deities, granting kingship to Baal. Asherah, the mother goddess, intercedes on behalf of Baal, petitioning El to support him. Anat emerges as a powerful figure, loyal and violent, embodying the protective and destructive aspects of divinity. The relationships among these gods mirror human political and familial structures, with councils, petitions, alliances, and conflicts. The myths reflect a cosmos, organized like a city-state, where authority is negotiated, contested, and reaffirmed through both conflict and reconciliation. Other Ugaritic texts expand this picture. Hymns and prayers to deities such as Dagon, Shapash the sun goddess, and Resheph the god of plague reveal the diversity of worship and the integration of natural forces into the divine order. Ritual texts describe offerings, festivals, and liturgies, showing how myth and ritual were intertwined. Epics such as the Tale of Anat add further layers, blending mythological and heroic themes. In this story, the hero Anat receives a divine bow crafted by Kothar Wakasis, provoking the jealousy of Anat, who desires the weapon for herself. When Anat refuses, Anat has him killed, and his death brings drought and sterility to the land. The tale reflects themes of divine human interaction, the consequences of hubris, and the fragile balance of fertility and death. Like the Baal cycle, it ties cosmic order to human action, Making myth a mirror of both divine and human realities, the Kirta epic offers yet another dimension, telling the story of King Kirta, who suffers the loss of his family and seeks divine aid to restore his dynasty. El appears as the god who grants him a vision and promises him descendants, but Kirta's failure to fulfill his vows leads to illness and crisis. The tale blends themes of kingship, divine justice, and human frailty, illustrating the dependence of rulers on divine favour and the consequences of neglecting obligations. This epic, while mythological in tone, also reflects the concerns of real-world kings, whose legitimacy and survival depended on both political skill and religious devotion. The literary style of Ugaritic texts reveals a sophisticated poetic tradition. Parallelism, repetition, and formulaic expressions give the epics a rhythmic and oral character, suggesting that they were performed in ritual contexts. The texts were not simply read, but recited, sung, or dramatized, binding the community to the myths through performance. The scribal schools of Ugarit preserved these traditions in writing, but their form reflects an oral heritage that stretched back generations. Through these performances, myths became not only stories but lived experiences, reinforcing the structures of belief and practice that sustained Canaanite society. The discovery of these texts has been invaluable for understanding the broader ancient world. Before their excavation, much of what was known about Canaanite religion came from biblical texts, which portrayed it in polemical terms, emphasizing idolatry and practices condemned by Israelite writers. The Ugaritic text revealed the richness and coherence of Canaanite religion on its own terms, showing its complexity, depth, and beauty. They demonstrated that Canaanite myths were not crude or simplistic, but sophisticated narratives that addressed fundamental questions of existence, the nature of divinity, the cycles of life and death, the responsibilities of kingship, and the place of humanity in the cosmos. The influence of Ugaritic literature extended beyond its own culture. Parallels between Ugaritic and biblical texts are striking. Psalms that describe Yahweh defeating the waters of chaos echo Baal's victory over Yam. Prophetic denunciations of Baal worship reflect the real presence and power of his cult in the region. Even the language of covenant, kingship, and divine assembly in biblical tradition shows resonances with Ugaritic concepts. This continuity underscores the shared cultural milieu of the Levant, where Israelites and Canaanites drew from common traditions even as they diverged in theology and identity. The preservation of these myths in Ugarit reflects not only the creativity of its scribes, but the importance of literature as a means of cultural memory. By recording myths, rituals, and epics, the scribes ensured that their traditions would endure beyond the life of the city itself. Ugarit was destroyed around 1200 BCE, likely in the upheavals associated with the Sea Peoples and the collapse of the Late Bronze Age. Yet its texts survived in the ruins, buried for millennia until modern excavations brought them to light. In this way, the voices of Ugaritic poets, priests and scribes reached across time, preserving the legacy of Canaanite literature for the modern world. The significance of Ugarit in the study of the Canaanites lies not only in the content of its texts, but in their existence at all. They provide direct evidence of how the Canaanites understood their gods, their kings, their world, and themselves. They allow us to hear their prayers, to witness their rituals, and to enter into their imagination. Without Ugarit, much of this would remain hidden, known only through the hostile lens of later traditions. With Ugarit, we can appreciate the Canaanites as a literate, poetic, and theologically rich culture, whose legacy extended far beyond their own time. From this treasury of myth and epic, the story of the Canaanites moves into the turbulence of the end of the Bronze Age, when the forces of invasion, collapse, and migration reshaped the entire Near East, bringing destruction to cities like Ugarit, and forcing new forms of survival and adaptation upon the people of the Levant. Toward the end of the second millennium BCE, the world of the Canaanites was shaken by one of the most dramatic upheavals in ancient history, an event remembered today as the Bronze Age collapse. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, civilizations that had thrived for centuries, Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, Ugarit on the northern Levantine coast, and many of the great cities of Canaan itself, experienced destruction, depopulation, and disintegration. The reasons for this widespread collapse remain debated, but the archaeological record and scattered texts attest to waves of migration, famine, social unrest, and the incursions of groups remembered collectively as the Sea Peoples. For the Canaanites, these changes meant the end of the world as they had known it, but also the birth of new possibilities, as old powers gave way to new polities, and survival required adaptation to radically altered circumstances. The Sea Peoples occupy a central place in this story. Egyptian inscriptions, particularly those from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramses III, describe invasions by seaborne groups who swept across the eastern Mediterranean, destroying cities and threatening Egypt itself. These inscriptions list the names of various peoples, the Sherden, Shekelesh, Peliset, Denian and others, who came by both land and sea, armed and accompanied by their families seeking new lands. Ramses III's inscriptions at Medinet Habu boast of his victories over these invaders around 1177 BCE, depicting them with distinctive helmets, feathered headdresses and ox-drawn carts. While Egyptian propaganda celebrated these defeats, the destruction levels across the Levant and Anatolia suggest that many cities did not survive their arrival. Ugarit, the jewel of Canaanite culture and literature, was among the victims. Excavations show that it was destroyed suddenly around this time, its archives buried under collapsed buildings, its palaces and temples left in ruins. Letters found at Ugarit revealed desperate appeals for help in the face of impending attack, one of them noting that enemy ships had already set fire to the land. No help came, and the city perished. Other centres along the coast and inland suffered similar fates, leaving behind layers of ash, collapsed fortifications and abandoned homes. The devastation was widespread enough that archaeologists speak of a systemic collapse, not just isolated destruction. The causes of this upheaval are complex. The arrival of the Sea Peoples was one factor, but not the only one. Evidence points to a convergence of crises: climate change leading to drought and famine, internal rebellions against ruling elites, disruption of long-distance trade networks, and the decline of centralized powers like the Hittites and Egyptians. For centuries, the late Bronze Age world had been sustained by an interconnected system of trade and diplomacy. Grain flowed from Egypt, timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia and Cyprus, luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. This system made kingdoms prosperous, but it also made them vulnerable. When trade routes were disrupted, cities dependent on imported resources faced hardship. When drought reduced harvests, famine weakened populations already strained by war. The collapse was not the result of a single invasion, but the breakdown of a fragile web that had held the region together. For the Canaanites, these events were catastrophic but not terminal. Coastal cities like Ugarit and many inland centres were destroyed, but others endured. Sidon and Tyre, though scarred by the turbulence, survived and emerged stronger in the Iron Age, becoming the leading cities of Phoenicia. Their survival may have been due to geography, fortifications, or sheer adaptability, but it ensured the continuity of Canaanite traditions into a new age. Inland, some cities were abandoned, while new settlements arose in the highlands, reflecting shifts in population and political organisation. The decline of Egyptian control over Canaan further reshaped the landscape, as local rulers gained autonomy or succumbed to new pressures. The presence of the Peliset, identified with the Philistines of later biblical tradition, illustrates how the upheavals created new identities. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron and Gath reveals material culture with Aegean connections, pottery styles, architecture and diet that point to origins among the Sea Peoples. These groups settled along the southern coast of Canaan, establishing the Philistine Pentapolis, a league of 5 cities that became a powerful force in the region. Their arrival transformed the cultural and political landscape, introducing new styles of art, weaponry, and social organisation. Yet even as they brought new elements, they interacted with and absorbed Canaanite traditions, becoming part of the region's ongoing story. The collapse of the Bronze Age was also a turning point in the balance of power. The great empires that had once dominated Canaan weakened or disappeared. The Hittite Empire crumbled, never to rise again. Egypt, though victorious against the Sea Peoples in its own propaganda, retreated from much of its Levantine territory, focusing on defending its own borders. Assyria, still a rising power in Mesopotamia, had not yet extended its dominance westward. This created a vacuum in which smaller polities could flourish. The Phoenician cities of the coast, heirs of Canaanite maritime traditions, took advantage of the new freedom to expand their trade networks, eventually establishing colonies across the Mediterranean. Inland, new groups such as the Israelites consolidated, building their identity in the absence of imperial oversight. The collapse of the Old Order thus gave rise to the patchwork of Iron Age cultures that defined the first millennium BCE. The human cost of this collapse, however, was immense. Archaeological evidence of famine, population decline, and violent destruction testifies to the suffering endured by ordinary people. Skeletons found in destruction layers show trauma from warfare, while storage jars emptied of grain suggest scarcity and hunger. Abandoned villages and depopulated regions reveal the scale of displacement, as survivors fled from devastated cities to safer areas. The collapse was not only political but social, breaking the networks that had sustained communities for centuries. Yet resilience remained. The persistence of religious traditions, the rebuilding of cities, and the continuation of agricultural and domestic practices show that life adapted to the new realities. The myths of Baal and Mot, which dramatise the cycle of death and renewal, may have taken on even deeper resonance in this period, as communities confronted the destruction of their world and sought hope in the promise of restoration. The survival of texts at Ugarit, buried in ruins yet preserved for millennia, is itself a symbol of continuity amid collapse. For the Canaanites who lived through this transformation, the end of the Bronze Age was both a catastrophe and a moment of rebirth. Their world of city-states bound by Egyptian and Hittite power was gone, replaced by a new order in which smaller polities and migrating peoples reshaped the map. Their culture, however, endured, carried forward by the survivors who adapted to new circumstances. The seafaring traditions that had sustained Byblos, Sidon and Tyre now laid the foundation for Phoenician expansion. The highland settlements that arose in the aftermath would form the roots of Israelite identity. The Philistine newcomers brought new challenges and exchanges, weaving themselves into the Canaanite fabric. Out of collapse came transformation, a pattern as cyclical as the myths that told of Baal's death and return. The shifting powers of this age set the stage for the emergence of Phoenicia, and for the continuation of Canaanite traditions in new forms. As the old order crumbled, the resilience of coastal cities and the adaptability of their people ensured that the legacy of Canaan did not vanish but evolved, carrying its influence into the Iron Age and beyond. From this turbulent reordering of the ancient world, the narrative of the Canaanites moves toward the transformation of identity that came with the rise of Phoenicia, when the descendants of these Bronze Age survivors built new networks of trade and culture that reached far across the Mediterranean, ensuring their place in history long after the memory of the collapse had faded. In the centuries that followed the turmoil of the Bronze Age collapse, the people of the Levant, heirs of the Canaanite tradition, did not vanish, but instead transformed themselves into what later generations would know as the Phoenicians. This transformation was not an abrupt rupture, but a gradual adaptation shaped by survival, resilience, and the opportunities that emerged from the shifting political and economic landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. Where earlier Canaanite city-states had lived under the shadow of Egyptian dominance or Hittite power, the new age allowed greater independence. Out of this independence came a reinvention, one rooted in the same geography, language and traditions, but directed toward new horizons. The continuity between Canaanites and Phoenicians is visible in every aspect of their culture. The people who called themselves the inhabitants of Sidon, Tyre, Byblos and Arwad did not regard themselves as something new or disconnected from their past. They spoke the same northwest Semitic language that their Canaanite ancestors had spoken, worshipped the same deities under familiar names, lived in the same cities, and built upon the same foundations. It was the outside world, particularly the Greeks, who labelled them Phoenicians, a name derived from phoenix, meaning purple, in reference to the famed purple dye extracted from the murex shells of their coast. The name, while foreign, stuck, and it came to symbolise their identity in the eyes of others. But at their core, they were the continuation of Canaanite culture, reshaped to meet the demands of a new age. The geographical advantages that had always characterised the Canaanite coast continued to define the Phoenician world. Narrow plains pressed between mountains and sea limited large-scale agriculture, but the cedar forests of Lebanon, the sheltered harbours of the coastline, and the proximity to inland trade routes all favoured maritime commerce. With the old networks of Bronze Age trade disrupted, the Phoenician cities carved out new ones. They became the brokers of the Mediterranean, connecting east and west, supplying timber, metals, glass, textiles, and above all the purple-dyed cloth that became a symbol of prestige across the ancient world. Their ships, built with the same cedar that had sailed to Egypt in earlier centuries, now ranged farther than ever before, reaching Cyprus, Greece, Sicily, North Africa, and beyond. The rise of Phoenician maritime power was both a continuation of Canaanite seafaring and an expansion upon it. Where the earlier Canaanites had traded with neighbours and distant partners, the Phoenicians began to establish permanent colonies and trading stations. Carthage, founded in the 9th century BCE, became the most famous of these settlements, eventually rivaling Rome itself. Other colonies dotted the coasts of the western Mediterranean, serving as outposts of trade and culture. This expansion was not a matter of conquest, but of commerce. The Phoenicians sought harbours, markets, and networks rather than empires, and their influence spread through exchange rather than military domination. This strategy ensured their survival in a world dominated by larger, more militarized states. Culturally, the Phoenicians preserved the pantheon of their Canaanite ancestors. El, Baal, Asherah, and Anat remained central figures, though local variations emphasized different deities. In Tyre, Melkart, a form of Baal associated with kingship and the sea, became the chief god, his temple dominating the city and his cult spreading to colonies abroad. In Sidon, Astarte was particularly prominent, reflecting the enduring power of female deities in Levantine religion. These gods were not abstract, but present in the rhythms of life, fertility, navigation, and kingship. Rituals, sacrifices, and festivals continued as they had in Canaanite times, though they now extended across a wider world as Phoenician merchants carried their traditions abroad. Colonists in far-off lands built temples to Melkart, Baal, and Astarte, ensuring that the gods of Canaan remained worshipped across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians also preserved and spread the alphabet, one of the greatest legacies of their Canaanite heritage. The simple system of consonantal symbols developed in Canaan for practical record-keeping became the foundation of a script that was adapted and adopted by cultures across the Mediterranean. The Greeks borrowed it, added vowels, and transmitted it to the Latin alphabet, which remains the basis of much of the modern world's writing. This achievement was not the product of a sudden invention, but of generations of scribal development, perfected and disseminated by Phoenician traders whose need for simple and portable writing systems made the alphabet indispensable. In this way, a Canaanite contribution became a global one, transmitted through the hands of Phoenician sailors. Politically, the Phoenician world differed from the great empires that surrounded it. It was not a centralized kingdom, but a collection of independent city-states, each with its own king, council, and traditions. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and others competed and cooperated, sometimes allying with or resisting foreign powers, sometimes rivaling one another. This political fragmentation was a continuation of Canaanite patterns, where city-states dominated the landscape. Yet under the Phoenicians, these cities developed remarkable resilience. Their wealth from trade gave them resources to negotiate with larger empires, while their ships allowed them to project influence far beyond their small territories. When Assyria and later Babylon demanded tribute, the Phoenicians paid, but they also continued to thrive, their networks extending beyond the reach of imperial armies. Their ability to adapt to foreign domination without losing their identity was a hallmark of their survival. The transformation from Canaanite to Phoenician is perhaps best understood as a shift in emphasis rather than essence. The Canaanites had always been traders, sailors, and intermediaries, but under the pressures and opportunities of the Iron Age, these traits became their defining characteristics. The loss of inland dominance and the decline of its older centres pushed them toward the sea, where they excelled. Their resilience in the face of collapse and invasion became a strategy of survival, and their willingness to adapt without abandoning their traditions allowed them to endure for centuries in a competitive world. Archaeological evidence illustrates this continuity and transformation. In Byblos, temples to Baal and other gods continued to function into the Iron Age, even as new influences appeared in art and architecture. In Tyre, monumental structures reflect both local traditions and foreign styles, showing how the city absorbed influences while maintaining its own identity. In Sidon, cemeteries reveal both continuity with earlier Canaanite burial practices and adaptations to changing times. The material culture of the Phoenicians is recognizably Canaanite but enriched by contact with Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and beyond. The transformation also had social dimensions. Merchant families gained prominence, their wealth from overseas trade giving them power within the cities. Artisans and sailors became essential members of society, their skills fueling the economic engine of the city-states. Kings continued to rule, but their authority was often balanced by councils of elders or by the influence of powerful merchant elites. This diffusion of power made the Phoenician cities adaptable and resilient, less dependent on a single ruler and more capable of adjusting to external pressures. The survival of the Phoenicians was not without challenges. Their cities were often caught between empires, forced to pay tribute to Assyria, Babylon, and later Persia. Yet they turned this subjugation into opportunity, serving as shipbuilders, sailors, and traders for their overlords, while maintaining their own networks of influence. The story of Phoenicia is not one of conquest, but of endurance, where a people rooted in the Canaanite past reshaped themselves to thrive in a changing world. Through their ships, their colonies, their gods, and their alphabet, the Phoenicians carried the legacy of the Canaanites far beyond the Levant. They ensured that the cultural achievements of their ancestors did not disappear with the collapse of the Bronze Age, but lived on in new forms, shaping the history of the Mediterranean. Their transformation was a testament to the resilience of Canaanite identity, proving that even in the face of destruction and displacement, survival was possible through adaptation and reinvention. From this transformation, the story of the Canaanites flows into the ways in which their culture and traditions were remembered and reinterpreted in later times, particularly in the biblical tradition, where they became symbols, foils, and ancestors within the unfolding narratives of Israel and its neighbours. The memory of the Canaanites lived on most vividly in the texts of the Hebrew Bible, where they appear again and again as neighbours, adversaries, and warnings. Yet the portrayal of the Canaanites in biblical literature was never neutral. It was shaped by theological, cultural, and political concerns of Israelite writers who were seeking to define their own identity. In the process, Canaanite traditions, beliefs, and practices were recast into symbols of what Israel was to reject or overcome, even as Israel itself had grown out of the same soil and shared much of the same heritage. The biblical depiction of the Canaanites is therefore a paradox. It presents them as the quintessential other, yet the very features condemned are often those inherited or shared. From the outset, the biblical texts present the Canaanites as inhabitants of the land promised by God to Israel. In the book of Genesis, the Canaanites appear as descendants of Canaan, the son of Ham, marked by Noah's curse after the incident of Ham's dishonour. This genealogy places them within a framework of divine destiny, as a people destined to be dispossessed by Israel. In Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, the land of Canaan is described as the inheritance of Israel, a land flowing with milk and honey, yet one occupied by nations practicing abominations. The command to drive out the Canaanites, to destroy their altars and idols, and to avoid intermarriage with them is repeated as a central theme. The conquest narratives of Joshua depict the fulfillment of this command, with cities like Jericho and Ai falling to Israelite armies under divine sanction. This portrayal casts the Canaanites as the foil against which Israel's covenant identity is defined. Their worship of Baal and Asherah, their fertility rites, and their supposed practices of child sacrifice are presented as the very things Israel must reject in order to remain faithful to Yahweh. The biblical writers use the Canaanites as a symbol of idolatry, impurity and rebellion against divine order. In this way, the memory of Canaanite culture becomes a negative mirror, shaping Israelite identity by contrast. Yet the archaeological and cultural record suggests a more complicated reality. Many of the practices condemned in the biblical texts were not foreign intrusions, but deeply rooted in the shared cultural traditions of the region. The veneration of Baal, the use of standing stones and sacred groves, the presence of Asherah in household religion, all these were part of the Canaanite heritage that early Israelites also shared. The prophetic denunciations of Baal worship, in texts such as Hosea and Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, are intelligible only if Baal worship was widespread among Israelites themselves. Similarly, the condemnation of child sacrifice to Molech in the valley of Hinnom reflects the persistence of practices that were not alien but familiar. The biblical polemics thus reveal less about the Canaanites as distant others, and more about the struggles within Israelite society to define its distinctiveness. The biblical narratives themselves sometimes acknowledge this closeness. Stories of intermarriage between Israelites and Canaanites, such as the account of Rahab of Jericho or the Gibeonites who made a treaty with Joshua, show moments of integration rather than annihilation. The genealogies of Israelite heroes often include Canaanite or foreign women, blurring the lines of identity. Even King Solomon in the Book of Kings is described as marrying women from surrounding nations, including Canaanite groups, and building shrines for their gods. The tension between exclusivist theology and the realities of shared culture runs throughout the biblical tradition, reflecting the difficulty of drawing clear boundaries in a land of intermingled peoples. The memory of Canaanite religion in the Bible is shaped by polemic. The prophets rail against the high places, the sacred poles, the worship of Baal and Astarte, and the offering of children in fire. Yet these denunciations serve to highlight the persistence of such practices within Israel. The presence of Asherah, figurines in domestic shrines across Israelite sites, suggests that popular religion did not conform neatly to the official monotheism promoted by reforming kings and priests. Household piety often retained elements of the old Canaanite religion, adapted and blended with Yahweh worship. The biblical writers, seeking to promote exclusive devotion to Yahweh, cast these practices as dangerous remnants of Canaanite culture, to be purged in order to preserve covenant faith. The figure of El also illustrates continuity and transformation. In Ugaritic texts, El is the high god, father of gods and men enthroned in wisdom and age. In early Israelite religion, El appears as the god of the patriarchs, invoked under names such as El Elyon or El Shaddai. Over time, Yahweh absorbed El's titles and attributes, becoming not one god among many, but the one God of Israel. The transition from a Canaanite pantheon to Israelite monotheism was gradual. with older conceptions reinterpreted rather than simply rejected. The biblical condemnation of Canaanite religion is therefore not a rejection of something wholly alien, but the transformation of a shared tradition into a new theological framework. The biblical writers also use the Canaanites as a moral lesson. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the Canaanites are said to have been expelled from the land because of their abominations, sexual immorality, idolatry, and child sacrifice. Israel is warned that if it follows the same practices, it too will be expelled. In this way, the memory of the Canaanites becomes a cautionary tale, a theological explanation for the exile of Israel itself. Just as the Canaanites lost their land for their sins, so too would Israel if it failed to keep the covenant. The Canaanites thus serve as a narrative device for understanding both the promise and the peril of Israel's destiny. At the same time, the memory of Canaanite cities and traditions remained embedded in Israelite culture. Place names such as Jericho, Megiddo, and Hazor retained their resonance, their ruins serving as reminders of past struggles. Agricultural festivals rooted in Canaanite seasonal rites were reframed as commemorations of Israel's history, transforming local traditions into covenantal observances. Even the language of the Bible, Hebrew itself, carried within it the structures of Canaanite speech, a linguistic legacy that could not be erased. The Canaanites may have been depicted as other, but they were also embedded in the very fabric of Israel's identity. Later biblical texts reflect a more symbolic use of Canaanite imagery. The prophets often employ Baal as a metaphor for false gods, while the name of Canaan itself becomes shorthand for corruption or worldliness. Yet alongside this polemic, the Song of Songs and other poetic texts preserve imagery of fertility, gardens, and natural abundance that echoes Canaanite myth and ritual. The literary memory of Canaan was therefore not wholly negative. It lingered in language, metaphor, and symbolism, even when reinterpreted. The persistence of Canaanite culture in the biblical tradition illustrates the complexity of cultural memory. Israel defined itself in contrast to the Canaanites, yet it carried their legacy in language, practice, and imagination. The process of remembering the Canaanites was also a process of negotiating identity, deciding what to preserve, what to transform, and what to reject. The polemics against Canaanite religion reflect the intensity of this struggle, revealing how deeply intertwined the two cultures had been. In later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, the memory of the Canaanites continued to resonate. They were remembered as the original inhabitants of the land, sometimes as symbols of sin and idolatry, sometimes as figures of historical curiosity. Their role in biblical tradition ensured that their name would endure long after their cities had been destroyed and their people absorbed into others. In this way, the Canaanites became eternal through memory, even if their political independence had long since vanished. From this biblical remembrance, the story of the Canaanites moves naturally into the realm of archaeology, where the material remains of their cities, temples, inscriptions, and artifacts provide another kind of memory, one that speaks not through polemic but through stone, pottery, and buried texts, allowing us to reconstruct their world in tangible form. The memory of the Canaanites does not rest only in texts and later traditions. It is also preserved in the soil, the stones, and the broken fragments left behind in their cities and sanctuaries. Archaeology has become one of the most important ways of recovering their world, giving voice to a people whose own written records are scarce, and whose legacy was often reshaped by others. Excavations across the Levant have uncovered temples, pottery, inscriptions, fortifications, and household artifacts, all of which together paint a picture of daily life, religious practice, and cultural continuity. Through these remains, the Canaanites emerge not merely as figures of biblical polemic, but as a living civilization with its own complexities, achievements, and resilience. The temples of the Canaanites stand as some of the most striking evidence of their religious life. At sites such as Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, and Shechem, archaeologists have uncovered monumental temples built of stone and mud brick, with wide courtyards, central halls, and raised platforms for sacrifices. These sanctuaries were not only centres of worship, but also focal points of social and political life, where rulers demonstrated their authority through association with the gods. In Hazor, the discovery of a large temple complex revealed altars, cultic vessels, and carved statues, including representations of deities such as Baal. The scale of these structures underscores the importance of religion in legitimizing political power, while the diversity of objects within them reflects the blending of local and foreign traditions. Egyptian-style statues, Mesopotamian-inspired motifs, and distinctly Levantine designs appear side by side, evidence of a cosmopolitan culture that absorbed and adapted influences from its neighbours. Household shrines provide another dimension of religious practice. Small clay figurines of female deities, often interpreted as representations of Asherah or other fertility goddesses, have been found in domestic contexts across Canaanite and early Israelite sites. These figurines, sometimes crude and sometimes finely made, suggest that devotion was not confined to monumental temples, but extended into the private sphere of family life. Incense altars, libation vessels, and miniature cult objects reveal how households participated in rituals of blessing, fertility, and protection. The presence of these objects demonstrates the continuity of religious devotion across social classes, where even ordinary families engaged in practices that link them to the divine. Pottery is among the most abundant evidence of Canaanite culture, and its variations allow archaeologists to trace chronology, trade, and cultural exchange. Canaanite pottery evolved through distinctive styles, from the handmade wares of the early Bronze Age to the wheel-made and decorated vessels of later periods. In the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, Canaanite potters produced fine wares with burnished surfaces, painted geometric designs and elaborate shapes. Storage jars, amphorae, and cooking pots reveal not only artistic choices, but also the practical needs of daily life, preserving grain, storing oil and wine, and cooking meals. The widespread distribution of Canaanite pottery across the Mediterranean testifies to the extent of their trade networks. Amphorae from Canaanite kilns have been found in Cyprus, Egypt, and even as far as the Aegean, showing how deeply integrated they were into international commerce. Imported pottery in turn appears in Canaanite cities, reflecting reciprocal exchange. Mycenaean vessels with intricate designs, Cypriot wares with distinctive decorations, and Egyptian alabaster jars all appear in archaeological layers, often in elite contexts. These objects reveal not only trade but also the tastes of Canaanite elites who displayed foreign goods as symbols of wealth and status. Pottery thus becomes more than just utilitarian. It becomes a marker of identity, exchange, and participation in the broader cultural world of the Late Bronze Age. Inscriptions and writing provide perhaps the most direct evidence of Canaanite culture. Though fewer than those of Mesopotamia or Egypt, inscriptions from Canaan include early alphabetic texts, administrative records, and dedicatory inscriptions. The discovery of Proto-Canaanite inscriptions at sites like Serabit el-Kadim in the Sinai demonstrates the origins of the alphabet, a revolutionary simplification of writing that used a small set of symbols to represent consonantal sounds. This system, developed for practical purposes by Canaanite-speaking workers in Egyptian-controlled mines, eventually spread and evolved into the Phoenician alphabet, which in turn became the ancestor of Greek, Latin, and many modern scripts. These modest carvings on stone and pottery fragments thus represent one of the most significant contributions of the Canaanites to world history. At Ugarit, the development of a cuneiform alphabet allowed the preservation of myths, rituals, and epics, creating a written tradition that has given us unparalleled insight into Canaanite religion. Elsewhere, shorter inscriptions reveal glimpses of everyday life. Dedicatory texts on altars or votive objects bear the names of donors and deities, linking individuals to acts of piety. Seal impressions used in administration show the names of rulers, officials, and sometimes gods, connecting the political and religious spheres. These inscriptions confirm the use of the Canaanite language in official and sacred contexts, grounding the biblical references to Canaanite names and places in real historical evidence. The remains of fortifications, palaces, and domestic structures provide further detail about Canaanite society. Excavations at Megiddo, Hazor, and Jericho reveal massive defensive walls, monumental gates, and towers, demonstrating the importance of security in a land often contested by rival city-states and foreign powers. Palaces with large halls, storerooms, and administrative spaces indicate the presence of centralized authority, where rulers coordinated trade, collected tribute, and organized labor. The luxury items found within some of these palaces, ivory carvings, imported vessels, gold ornaments, attest to the wealth of the elites, while the smaller houses surrounding them reflect the lives of ordinary citizens. Streets, courtyards, and workshops reveal the rhythms of daily life, where artisans, merchants, and farmers sustained the urban economy. Burial practices, as revealed in tombs, further illustrate Canaanite beliefs about death and the afterlife. Tombs filled with pottery, jewellery, and weapons reflect the care given to the dead and the belief in continuity beyond death. The repeated use of family tombs over generations underscores the importance of kinship and ancestry. Inscriptions, when present, give names and sometimes titles, allowing individuals to be remembered long after their passing. These material remains confirm the textual evidence of ancestor veneration and the integration of death into the social and religious fabric of Canaanite life. What is particularly striking about the archaeological record is the balance between continuity and change. Across centuries of political upheaval, foreign domination, and cultural exchange, the essential features of Canaanite life persisted. City-states organized around temples and palaces, households engaged in both agriculture and trade, religious devotions centered on a pantheon of gods, and a material culture that reflected both local traditions and international connections. Yet within this continuity, the Canaanites also adapted constantly, adopting new styles, technologies, and influences from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Aegean. Their resilience is evident in the ways their cities were rebuilt after destruction, their traditions maintained alongside innovations, and their identity preserved even as it evolved into Phoenician forms in later centuries. The artifacts and structures unearthed from Canaanite sites allow us to move beyond the polemics of biblical texts and the fragmentary references of foreign inscriptions. They let us see the texture of Canaanite life, the vessels used to prepare meals, the figurines placed on household altars, the seals pressed into clay tablets, the walls that defended cities, the tombs that housed generations. Each piece tells a story, and together they reveal a civilization deeply rooted in its land, connected to its neighbours, and influential far beyond its borders. From these archaeological traces, the story of the Canaanites flows naturally into the ways their memory and legacy persisted in later traditions, not only in biblical accounts, but also in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, where they continued to play a role in the shaping of history and identity long after their political independence had ended. The Canaanites, though their independent cities faded into history long ago, lived on in memory through the texts, traditions, and interpretations of later religious communities. Their presence remained vivid in Jewish scripture, was reinterpreted in Christian theology, and echoed again in Islamic literature. In each tradition, the Canaanites served as more than just an ancient people. They became symbols, moral lessons, and historical markers. The transformation of their image across these faiths shows how memory is never static, but reshaped according to the concerns of later generations. What had once been a living culture of city-states became, over time, a remembered people, whose meaning was framed by theological debates, political realities, and the search for identity. In Jewish tradition, the memory of the Canaanites was firmly anchored in the biblical narratives that defined Israel's origins. The Canaanites were remembered as the inhabitants of the land promised to Abraham and his descendants, those who had to be displaced in order for the covenant people to take possession of their inheritance. They were described in the Torah as nations practicing idolatry, fertility cults, and child sacrifice, practices deemed abhorrent to Yahweh. Their cities were portrayed as formidable, their walls high and their armies strong, yet they were destined to fall before the divine plan. This narrative gave theological meaning to Israel's claim to the land, presenting the conquest not merely as a historical event, but as the unfolding of divine justice. The memory of the Canaanites in Jewish tradition was not limited to conquest narratives. They were also used as exemplars of the consequences of sin. Levitical texts describe the land as vomiting out its inhabitants because of their abominations, a warning to Israel that the same fate would befall them if they repeated such practices. In this way, the Canaanites served as a cautionary tale, a mirror in which Israel saw both its privilege and its danger. The exile of the Israelites to Babylon centuries later could be explained in terms of this same logic. Just as the Canaanites had lost their land, so too could Israel when it failed in its covenant obligations. The memory of Canaan thus became a moral framework for understanding history, not simply a record of past events. Later Jewish tradition preserved these themes but also added layers of interpretation. Rabbinic literature often revisited the story of Canaan's curse in Genesis, where Noah cursed Canaan, the son of Ham, declaring that he would be a servant to his brothers. This story was taken as a justification for Israelite dominance over the Canaanites, embedding their subjugation in divine decree. The rabbis also debated the extent to which Canaanites could be integrated into Israel. Some texts emphasize their destruction or exclusion, while others acknowledge instances of assimilation, such as the story of Rahab of Jericho, who joined the Israelite community. These discussions reflect the tension between the memory of the Canaanites as enemies and the reality of shared heritage and intermarriage in the ancient past. In Christian thought, the Canaanites were remembered primarily through the biblical texts inherited from Judaism, but their role was reinterpreted in light of Christian theology. For the early church, the conquest narratives of Joshua were not simply stories of ancient battles, but allegories of spiritual struggle. The Canaanites came to symbolize sin, idolatry, and the old order of the flesh, which had to be overcome by the new order of faith in Christ. The destruction of Canaanite altars and idols was seen as a metaphor for the rejection of paganism and the triumph of monotheism. In this allegorical reading, the Canaanites were less a historical people than a symbol of all that opposed God's kingdom. The story of Rahab took on special significance in Christian tradition. In the New Testament, Rahab is praised in the letter to the Hebrews as an example of faith, for she welcomed the Israelite spies and trusted in their God. In the Gospel of Matthew, Rahab is included in the genealogy of Jesus, making her a symbolic figure of inclusion, one who, though a Canaanite and a prostitute, became part of the story of salvation. Her example softened the image of the Canaanites, showing that faith could overcome ancestry, and that even those cast as enemies in earlier texts could become models of redemption in Christian thought. Patristic writers of the early church often used the Canaanites in their homilies and theological reflections. Origen, for instance, interpreted the wars against the Canaanites as representing the believer's internal struggle against sin. Augustine read them as allegories of the Church's triumph over heresy and idolatry. In these interpretations, the historical details of Canaanite life mattered less than the symbolic role assigned to them. The Canaanites became timeless representatives of resistance to God, whose defeat affirmed divine sovereignty. Through such readings, their memory was preserved but transformed into a spiritual lesson that transcended the historical context. In Islamic thought, the memory of the Canaanites appears in different forms, shaped by Quranic references, later commentaries, and the broader Islamic engagement with biblical history. The Quran does not mention the Canaanites by name, but it does recount stories of ancient peoples destroyed for their sins, stories that parallel the biblical accounts of the fate of Canaanite nations. Commentators sometimes identified these peoples with the Canaanites, situating them among the groups who were punished by God for idolatry and injustice. the figure of the Israelites entering the land, facing resistance from its inhabitants, and receiving divine guidance resonates with Islamic interpretations that emphasize God's judgment and mercy. Later, Islamic historians and geographers incorporated Canaanites into their accounts of the past. They sometimes connected them with the Amalekites or other ancient peoples mentioned in both Jewish and Islamic traditions. In some versions, Canaanites were remembered as early inhabitants of Syria and Palestine, associated with great cities and ancient kings. Their role was often framed within the larger narrative of prophetic history, where they were one of many nations that rose, sinned and fell, serving as examples of the impermanence of worldly power and the justice of divine decree. In all three traditions, Jewish, Christian and Islamic, the Canaanites became more than a historical people. They became symbols, moral exemplars, and narrative devices. In Jewish memory, they were the dispossessed, whose fate warned Israel of the dangers of sin. In Christian thought, they were allegories of sin and idolatry, overcome by faith and grace. In Islamic tradition, they were part of the pattern of nations judged by God, reminders of the fleeting nature of power. Across these traditions, the Canaanites served as a canvas upon which later generations painted their own concerns, whether about identity, morality, or divine justice. Yet even as these traditions reshaped their memory, the Canaanites continued to echo in place, names, cultural practices, and shared heritage. The cities of their land, Jericho, Hebron, Sidon, Tyre, remained important in the histories of all three faiths. The agricultural cycles and festivals rooted in Canaanite traditions continue to shape religious calendars. The stories of Baal, El, and Asherah, though transformed, lingered in the background of monotheistic theology. The memory of the Canaanites was therefore not only a matter of texts and allegories, but also of lived continuity, embedded in the very fabric of the Levant. From these echoes in religious thought, the story of the Canaanites flows into the broader question of legacy, of how a people who never created a vast empire or left behind monumental inscriptions still managed to shape the imagination of later ages and remain part of the world history through memory, myth, and rediscovery. The Canaanites never forged a vast empire, never carved their names on the colossal monuments that defined Egypt, never compiled law codes as extensive as those of Mesopotamia, and never ruled over wide territories like the Hittites or Persians. Yet their legacy endured in ways that outlasted many of those empires. Their influence was subtle, often indirect, and carried forward through cultural diffusion, linguistic inheritance, and the memories preserved by others. They were a people of crossroads, living at the junction of continents and civilizations, and it was precisely this position that allowed their legacy to spread so widely. Though the name Canaanite faded over centuries, the impact of their traditions, ideas, and contributions reverberated across the Mediterranean and beyond, shaping history in ways that are still felt today. One of their greatest legacies lies in the realm of writing. The development of the alphabet in Canaan, born out of practical necessity, became one of the most transformative innovations in human history. Unlike the complex systems of cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs, the alphabet used a limited set of consonantal symbols, easy to learn and flexible in application. This simplicity made literacy accessible beyond the narrow class of trained scribes. From the Proto-Canaanite inscriptions carved in the Sinai to the more refined Phoenician scripts, the alphabet spread along trade routes carried by merchants and sailors. The Greeks adapted it, adding vowels, and from them came the Latin script, which underpins much of the writing system used across the modern world. Every time letters are written in the Western tradition, they echo an invention first crafted in the hills, mines, and cities of Canaan. The Canaanites also left a profound religious and mythological legacy. The pantheon of El, Baal, Asherah, Anat, and other deities provided themes and imagery that influenced neighbouring cultures and found echoes in later traditions. The the cosmic struggle between the storm god and the forces of chaos, preserved in Ugaritic texts, resonates with later biblical imagery of Yahweh subduing the waters and slaying Leviathan. Fertility rituals, sacred groves, and household figurines endured in Israelite religion, even as reformers denounced them. Elements of Canaanite myth were absorbed into Greek and Roman traditions, carried by Phoenician expansion westward. In North Africa and Carthage, Melkart of Tyre became associated with Heracles, a blending of mythologies that illustrates how Canaanite religion adapted and persisted across cultures. Their maritime legacy was equally significant. The skills in shipbuilding and navigation inherited and expanded by the Phoenicians turned the Levant into the hub of Mediterranean commerce. From small harbours like Byblos and Sidon, fleets sailed to Cyprus, Greece, Sicily, Spain and beyond, establishing networks of exchange that transmitted not only goods but ideas. The famous purple dye of the Phoenicians, extracted from murex shells along the Levantine coast, became a symbol of royalty and prestige throughout antiquity. The cedar wood of Lebanon built temples in Egypt, ships in Mesopotamia, and palaces across the Mediterranean. These exports, rooted in Canaanite resources and expertise, became essential elements of the material culture of empires far larger than their own. In every port where Phoenician ships docked, the legacy of Canaan travelled with them. The cultural memory of the Canaanites also became woven into the self-understanding of later civilizations. In Jewish tradition, they were remembered as the original inhabitants of the Promised Land, their practices both feared and condemned, yet also deeply influential. In Christian interpretation, they became symbols of idolatry and sin, used allegorically to describe the believer's struggle against the forces of corruption. In Islam, they were remembered as one among many ancient peoples who rose, sinned, and fell under divine judgment. Across these traditions, the Canaanites became more than a historical people. They became enduring symbols, woven into theological reflection and moral teaching. Their cities left marks that continued to shape history. Byblos remained a centre of trade for centuries, its name becoming synonymous with writing itself in the Greek word biblion, from which the word Bible is ultimately derived. Tyre and Sidon grew into powerful city-states, their merchants and colonies spreading Canaanite culture across the Mediterranean. Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers, became one of the greatest powers of the classical world, rivaling Rome and shaping the history of North Africa, Europe, and the wider Mediterranean basin. The roots of Carthage lay in the survival and transformation of Canaanite culture after the Bronze Age collapse, showing how their legacy was carried into entirely new chapters of world history. Even their artistry carried echoes into later ages. The ivory carvings of Canaanite artisans, discovered in palaces across the Levant and Mesopotamia, show intricate designs that blended local styles with Egyptian and Mesopotamian motifs. Their pottery, exported across the Mediterranean, became models for others. Their metalwork and jewellery revealed both technical skill and cosmopolitan taste. In every piece one sees the blending of influences characteristic of a people who lived at the crossroads of civilizations. Their art was not monumental like Egyptian temples, nor as uniform as Mesopotamian reliefs, but it was distinctive in its adaptability, absorbing and reshaping external styles into something uniquely Levantine. The endurance of Canaanite influence is also visible in language. Hebrew, Phoenician, Moabite, and other dialects of the Levant were all part of the broader Canaanite linguistic family. In this sense, the Hebrew Bible itself is written in a Canaanite tongue, its words shaped by the same linguistic structures that had carried myths and prayers in Ugarit and Sidon centuries earlier. The very sound of biblical Hebrew is a legacy of Canaanite speech, carried forward even as its theology distinguished itself. This linguistic continuity ensures that the Canaanites remain present not only in memory, but in the very words preserved in sacred texts. Archaeological rediscovery in modern times added another layer to their legacy. The unearthing of Ugarit in the 20th century revealed texts that revolutionized the understanding of biblical history and Near Eastern religion. For the first time, scholars could read the myths of Baal, Anat and El directly, hearing the voices of the Canaanites themselves rather than only the polemics of others. These discoveries demonstrated the sophistication of their literature, the richness of their theology, and the depth of their culture. They showed that the Canaanites were not merely the villains of biblical memory, but a people of creativity, resilience, and influence. The rediscovery of their words rebalanced the view of their role in history, granting them recognition as shapers rather than only foils. Their endurance can also be traced in the persistence of place. The hills, plains, and coasts once occupied by the Canaanites became sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Jerusalem, Hebron, Sidon, Tyre, and countless other sites carried their legacy forward through continuous habitation, layered with new identities but always rooted in ancient foundations. The very landscape of the Levant is marked by their memory. Every ruin and tell a testament to lives lived and traditions practiced. In the broader sweep of world history, the Canaanites exemplify how influence does not require empire. They did not dominate through armies or annex distant lands, but through trade, ideas, and cultural transmission, they shaped the world around them. Their alphabet reshaped writing, their ships connected continents, their myths informed theology, and their cities became foundations for later powers. They endured not by overwhelming others, but by adapting, transmitting, and leaving traces that others would carry forward. Their story reminds us that history is not only written by conquerors, but also by those who endure through memory and transmission. From this enduring legacy, one sees how the Canaanites remained present across millennia, their contributions embedded in languages, religions, cities, and traditions long after their own name faded. Their memory carried forward into the modern rediscovery of their culture, where scholars, archaeologists, and historians continue to reconstruct their world and recognize their role in shaping civilization itself. The influence of the Canaanites, once obscured, now re-emerges as a reminder of how deeply interconnected the ancient world was, and how even peoples without great empires can leave legacies that shape human history.